the tattoo community, where tattoo artists, apprentices, and collectors are joining live events, sharing their tattoos and art, as well as creating art together across the globe. If you haven't already, you can find the mobile app on the Apple Store and Google Play. And once you have that app, you can find all of the awesome events going on. One of those coming up very soon will be a special biomech edition of Hablamos de Art with Bruno Salvatierra on April 6th at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I believe Guy will be visiting for that one. And tonight you are joining us for As Above, So Below, The Alchemy of Indirect Oil Painting Part 2 with David Heskin. 2 weeks ago we started our underpaintings, and today David will be guiding us through the overpaintings. Before we start, I just want to say thank you to our awesome sponsors, since they make it possible for us to bring this to you for free. So thank you to Inkjet Stencils. You can check out their sponsor area on the main menu of the app to learn how you can get free samples of their stencil mailed to you. Thank you to Raw Pigments. They make acrylic-free, organic, vegan inks from industry professionals. We also have on board Jesse Smith's shop, Loose Screw Tattoo, and they are still looking for resident artists right now, and they are having supplies covered, health, dental, paid vacation, and if you mention that you heard about all of this from us, he will know that you're interested in learning and growing. I'll now pass this on to Guy and David.
Thank you, Sandy. And thank you, David, for joining us again today. For those of us who are here for the first time that weren't able to make it to the first session, hopefully you had a chance to look at the recorded part one. But even if you did not, and this is your first time hopping on, if you've got questions, you can ask Sandy in the chat room, and she'll relate them to us so that we can bring them up. Yeah, David Heskin. I guess I've already introduced him last time, but I just wanted to say again, David is one of these rare cases of somebody who's, he's an incredible painter who's also in tattooing, and he actually left tattooing for a little bit. And this is not because of a loss of desire to do it, but he was exploring these other, classical art training, and dove deep into painting for a good number of years, 15-ish years, before coming back to tattooing, which I think is really exciting. Can't wait to see what he does. I've been seeing some designs he's been posting, exciting stuff. But he's got an incredible wealth of painting knowledge, and we've got these 2 paintings that we started 2 weeks ago. David, why don't you tell us a little bit about the theory of what we're going to be doing next here?
Awesome, thanks so much. It's really, really great to be back here and doing part 2. Well, in the first course, and sort of the title of this class is As Above, So Below, and it sort of implies that there's an upper layer of painting and a lower layer of painting. Of course, a lot of metaphorical, mythic things we can read into that title as well. We can explore some of that too, related to alchemy, but really just looking at dividing up the painting process into multiple stages. So last time we were looking at 2 different strategies in specific for underpainting. And we kind of consider the underpainting the drawing phase in a way. It's where we deal with composition, we deal with our light and shadow, kind of the building blocks. To a degree, transparency and opacity came into play. A little bit of temperature came into play. We had a warm underpainting and a cool underpainting, a grisaille in this case, with a grayscale, and then a bistre, or sort of a brown underpainting. So there were 2 different approaches, and we're going to see how the overpainting is determined to a degree by how we've begun. And we're taking these paintings in 2 stages, more or less. You can extend an indirect, meaning a layered painting process, indefinitely. There's really no rules about this. It's just a way to to separate some of these functions, so we don't have to always crunch every single parameter of a painting in one shot. I really have a lot of respect for doing that, and for people who are fantastically good at it. And I really like to take my time. I consider this the scenic route of painting. So yeah, that's basically the long and short of it. And we'll get into the overpainting today. Fortunately, these videos are recorded, so even if we're not keeping up, you can go back and watch them. There's no way in my own practice that I would finish even a small, like a 9x12 underpainting, usually in the matter of hours that we have. I spent the last few weeks, spending a little time here and there, taking us a little further. everyone works differently, and there's really no right or wrong about it. I really think taking your time on each stage of the painting is, there's a lot to be had there, and you could take as much time as you wanted on the underpainting. Your overpainting will just be better for it. The idea is that we're not completely clobbering what we've done in the first session with our overpainting, but it's this interaction between the two that gives us a lot of interesting effects we can play with transparencies and optical mixtures. So there's some fun things that come into play that way. And I think really treating this as an experimental medium. We're coming from tattoo where we have to be precise. You have to nail it and put it there. There's not a lot of room for wondering, if it's going to work out or not. And this can really be an experimental opportunity. So, I like to use it as such. I love being mystified and kind of surprised at what happens. It's fun to build our knowledge base and to find predictability within painting, but it's really fun to be mystified, I think, as well. So this is a cool medium for that. Oils are really forgiving. If something doesn't work, you can mostly, wipe it off if your layer underneath is dry, and build up layers on top of it if something totally fails. That said, one of the things I wanted to introduce just to presence briefly when we're talking about layered painting is this concept of fat over lean. And we hear that a lot with oil painting. And it took me forever to really get what that was. And, people recite it as though it's, because we hear it so much if you look in painting manuals or hear it from people, but not a lot of people know what it really means. And there's a few ways that it applies, and it's just one of those rules. You could certainly break a rule and see how that goes. So it's not that it's 100% true 100% of the time, but it's a good axiom to play with. And really, it just means keeping the paint lean in the earlier layers. And we talk about fat or lean. Our oil is our fat. You want to think about it. So it means just not using too much oil in the under layers, in the underpainting. Oil, when it dries, it doesn't dry by evaporation, it oxidizes. And so it polymerizes and forms an actual, a layer of gloss to a degree. So in our earlier layers, I mixed a medium that was about 50%. This is a balsam turpentine. I like this brand a lot. It's a Lucas brand, balsam turpentine. It smells like pine trees. It's not your hardware store kind of garbage. This is like a really lovely essential oil of pine sap. So we mixed a medium about 50-50, which cut the fat of our oil, if that makes sense. It makes it more lean. Some people will just use turpentine or mineral spirits, as you like, and add that directly to your oil paint out of the tube. You can do that to a degree because the oil paint already contains oil, obviously. Too much terp or too much mineral spirits with your oil paint, and you will cut the binder, and you'll find out later when your paint dries, if you use too much of it, you can wipe your finger on it and the paint will come right up. So we don't want to do it too much, but to a degree, that would be a very lean way to start a painting. One other aspect, I guess part of that is, if you get too glossy in your first layer, your paint is going to start beating up in the next layer. It won't want to stick to it because you've sort of created this, impermeable surface. So we want to make sure if we're doing a lot of layers of paint that we don't get too glossy and too sort of impermeable right off the bat. That's kind of really important. The other piece of fat over lean that made more sense to me in recent years was flexibility of the paint layers. And you can think of this like underneath, like the oil is really the flexible piece. It kind of stretches and expands and contracts, and it's more fluid ultimately. You don't want the underneath layer, the base layer of your painting, to be more flexible than the layers that come on top. If it is, you're going to probably find cracking. Think of it like we, talk about a dried lake bed. Those layers on top have sort of dried out and desiccated more than the layers underneath are still wet and mobile. So you get this cracking that happens. Certainly that could be a fun effect in a painting, but if we're not trying to have it happen, it could destroy it. It could destroy a painting easily. So that's just the long and short of that.
And that can happen over a long stretch of time too, right?
It totally can.
You think your painting is all dry and good, and yeah.
your painting will not be fully dry in your lifetime. I mean, that's how slow oil, yeah, to the touch, certainly. But like that chemical process goes for decades. So that's just sort of the best practices that come out of hundreds and hundreds of years of science, really. So we can kind of thank, the Renaissance masters for, for getting these things figured out, I guess, and even before that. But so many paintings have not stood the test of time. We think all these paintings go in the museum, probably a fraction of the, of the masterworks that have been created actually stand the test of time. So if we're planning on making masterpieces, and of course all of us are, just museum bound, of course, let's make our paintings last. If it's something that we have the bandwidth for. If painting is just for fun, then don't worry about it too much. But if you're starting to think about these technical processes, it's something to consider. And it's it's good. It's just good layering practice. I mean, it just makes sense in terms of applying paint. It doesn't have to be about, becoming ending up in a history book or anything. So yeah, that's basically the long and short of it with fat over lean. It's just something to consider. Often, if you do have a painting that has too much gloss on it or won't take any more paint, there's still a few ways to deal with that. Dali famously would rub an onion or a potato. He'd cut it and then rub that on there, and the starchiness would sort of, seem to break down that oil barrier a little bit. One other thing you could do is get some really fine pumice powder, which you can get from somewhere like naturalpigments.com. Naturalpigments.com is a great place for all kinds of arcane materials and really high quality paints and things. But fine pumice powder, you can sort of rub it with your finger, and it's like a really fine sandpaper, almost like extremely fine, and it sort of chews up that impermeability a little bit and opens it back up. So all is not lost if it doesn't work. Also, I think in the materials list, I'd suggested the potential to add a bit of varnish. Damar varnish being one. I like Canada balsam. It's a bit superior for a few reasons of longevity and clarity. But regardless, any kind of varnish in the small addition to your oil, they always say use as little as you need to. Just it adds a little stickiness. It adds a little bit of tack and kind of break up that oil on oil, waxy beating up situation that we might find ourselves in. So yeah, those are just some technical considerations when layering paint. It's just something.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Certainly.
Have you ever found that certain colors actually glazing than others?
I think you broke up. Say that one more time. Certain colors
are less receptive to glazing than others. Like I had a painting that, I had a lot of light blue, and I think it was probably mostly cerulean. And, I did a light glaze over it. And over the course of the next 5 years, that layer of oil, and I was trying to go fat over lean, you know what I mean? But that layer of oil that I put over it just slowly gathered up into little boogers all over the surface.
Right. Do you remember what kind of oil you were using for the glaze by chance?
At that time, I was using like 60% linseed, 40% terp. Got it.
My first thought is that there may have been this that happened to me a lot at the early days of painting. I was just like, it would just sort of coalesce and be these little kind of golden beads of oil. And what I'm thinking is that was just like too much oil in the glaze. Like we're trying to be more fat, of course, but in a way there's like more oil than that pigment in the glaze could really hold on to. So the pigment may have sat there, but it was sort of like there wasn't maybe enough pigment to bind with all that oil, so it just sort of seeps out. Yeah, I've definitely had that happen. I think in a way that's what's led me in my practice, and I'm excited to mention this because it's something that we can play with. It's led me towards using thicker oils and thickening my own oil. And so this is not a particularly thick oil, but it's also it's not really thin. It's not watery. That bubble's taking a little bit of time to get up to the surface. So I like thickening my oils. And the one thing this does is it makes them a little more like a varnish. Often when they're doing restoration and looking into, say, a Van Eyck painting, they'll take samples and go, well, there's a little varnish here, but not here. And they're trying to figure out his working methods. And often one of the secrets of the old masters was thickening your oil. Da Vinci talked about it. And you can do this in the sun, or you can even just do it in a dish or even in a bottle. Just pour a little oil in it, say a ceramic dish, pirate your family's saucers if you like, and just leave a little bit of oil in there. And what will happen, and Dali talks about this in his Secrets of Magic Craftsmanship book. He kind of hints about it in a subtle way, but he basically left a little saucer of oil out on his windowsill. And of course, a wasp flew into it, and he attributed all these magical qualities of the oil to the wasp. But what he was getting at is thicken your oil, sun thicken it. And you could do this whether you're using poppy oil or walnut, or this is a sun thickened linseed that I've made. You can even do it simply by just leaving the lid off of your oil for long enough. Takes a lot longer this way, but it's better if your jar is like half empty. And the oil just gains a little bit of viscosity. It makes it more oily. It makes it stickier. It makes it thicker. And that can tend to help with that issue, because it's not using the same kind of oil as with the underpainting. A cold pressed oil, for instance, or an alkali refined oil is really thin and wants to run, whereas thickened oils or oils that we add a touch of varnish to have that extra bit of tack and stickiness, and they'll tend to stay in place better. So I guess that's sort of my solution to what I was experiencing some years ago, which is exactly what you talked about, Guy, that you put on the glaze, it looks great, and then over time that oil just sort of runs out of it, and you're like picking little goobers off of your painting. These things we get over time, but thickened oil honestly has been the savior for my life. This stuff is just amazing, and it has some fun working properties.
Any thoughts on Alkyds?
I don't use them that much, but I think I think they work. I think they work wonderfully, and I've seen people, most people I know who are painting with oils, or at least maybe half who are painting with oils, or just swear by them. And the Alkyds are, I believe, like a vegetable extraction of some kind. I don't exactly know how they're made, but they tend to dry really fast, which is really useful for layering and painting. Dry like as fast as acrylics, or maybe a little slower. And we're talking about liquid and these kind of things.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's like this middle ground. They're oil mixable, but they're not quite in like straight oil themselves. It's some kind of vegetable esters. Or alkyd, of course, is the term. So I use them a bit less. I have, but I've seen people work with them with fantastically successful results, for sure. For the best of all.
Yeah, I mean, I've been using mostly liquid for the last few years, and a lot of it is because of that experience I told you about with the oil. And actually, some of my major pieces I'm having to restore, which is a bummer, But it just feels like not only am I not seeing things happen after it dries with Alkyd, it seems like once it's dried, and it's just done. Yeah. But I haven't done any super thick layered Alkyd paintings either. They tend to be a reasonable amount of paint. So who knows? Maybe in 100 years, we'll all wish that we never heard of liquid. But right now it's been serving me pretty well, and I like the finish. It's kind of a semi-gloss finish.
Right. There's a nice satin kind of look to it. Yeah, time will tell. The only thing that we can know for sure will last, 500 years if we care, is things that are 500 years old, and we have some sense of the process. I think maybe if we care to participate in history, like on the back of your painting, maybe not right on the back of the canvas, but somewhere, like attach your working methods to it. It would be great for the future to know what worked and what didn't. Participate in this grand experiment. How can I think about that? I mean, one of my mentors said, when I was asking about some experimental different kinds of mediums, he said, sure, try it out on maybe like 50% of your paintings, but try some, use something works on the other 50%, just in case. I thought that was interesting advice anyway.
So can I ask you a couple of specific questions about your two panels here?
Of course.
Now, I guess the first question would be total, how many hours? Let's start with the brown one. Sure. How many hours total have you got in that?
Oh my. Let's see. Well, we had a few hours in class the other day. And then, I haven't gone extensive on this. I spent a little time during the Equinox event, and that was mostly it. Maybe like 3 or 4 hours. I kept it rather kind of loose and quick, and just tried to get to the point. Kind of kept the
see it up a little closer.
Certainly. Yeah. So, I kind of just kept it to the essence of it. We did a lot of that. These more subtle warm highlights, just wiping out with a rag, and then came in for the more sort of pointed, brighter highlights with some titanium white, wet into wet, basically. So this was all done just in one shot, wet. It's a little.
So is it
a little bit of gloss?
Is it bone dry right now?
Yeah, it's completely dry. I live in Colorado, so these things dry really fast. I'm fortunate for the weather here. I hear people talking about drying time and how slow it goes, and I'm always mystified. I'm like, but it dries too fast, and then I end up in a humid climate once in a while. It's like, oh, this is what they're talking about. It's very
that's
different.
Part of the reason I took on Liquin also is because of that.
Exactly.
Michelle is still using other things, and it's interesting. She found that there was an area of her painting where she used a lot of phthalo blue, and it dried like 2 weeks after everything else.
Yeah.
Funny how these things work. Like if it was a cobalt blue, it would have been dried first.
Right. Cobalt is a heavy metal, and the metals dry really fast. They actually use cobalt there's a cobalt dryer, or also known as Japan dryer. So you get most of them, like lead white, dries really fast compared to titanium. So the heavy metals, the really toxic ones, tend to dry faster. Phthalo being it was a product of the 19th century. It was a much more finely, it's still copper blue, but the particles are really small. It's really rich. And it's weird because the pigment itself isn't a liquid, it's solid, but those pigment particles affect drying time.
Mm-hmm.
And I will recommend, again, this book that is indispensable for this kind of thing, for learning about pigments if you're interested. Ralph Myers, 5th edition, is key. And it's chapter 2, and they give you all these profiles on all the different pigments, and from their color profiles to their toxicity, to their drying times. And each pigment has this description, a little bit of history about it, and it will tell you drying times. And other than just doing color swatches, this is a good way to kind of understand. It will tell you toxicity, oil film characteristics. I actually opened the phthalo green in this case, but just a lot of characteristics of the pigments, which is really, for nerds, this is fantastic. If you don't care, don't worry about it, and just do color swatches and see which ones dry faster. That's useful too. I think both are key, but
we have that book. I just didn't know it had the drying times in there. I mean, there's like 3,000 pages. So
yeah. Chapter 2 is the main thing I consult with this, and it's just all these pigments. Mostly it's not like reading material unless you're trying to put yourself to sleep, most of this stuff, but you definitely wouldn't read this cover to cover. But the key one. And 5th edition or later has that. The 4th edition doesn't have it. And I guess they're only up to 5, so just find the new edition. Very, very common book you can get around.
Can we see your other canvas?
Yep. So this was the Grisaille, the grayscale one. And whereas the brown one was painted a lot more transparently, we called it sort of the brown sauce. We made a burnt sienna glaze over the whole thing. This one was painted more piece to piece. I could take this further. Certainly. I didn't take this all the way to a sort of completed state. You can see it's a little sketchy still, but it's definitely enough to work with. And we were talking about you could start a little looser and get a little tighter in the overpainting. So that's probably what I'll aim for.
Yeah, I mean, of course, you were showing us some examples of paintings that were taken 90 or 95% of the way there with the underpainting. Right. And so what you've got left is just color glazes pretty much, and highlights.
Yeah, exactly. And it just comes down to working style. I would prefer that each layer of the painting have some creativity involved in it. I mean, we're not just robots, and particularly as tattooers, this should be, I feel like this should be an opportunity for a new form of expression, not necessarily just about the render, but to each their own, for sure. I mean, I'm down to loving my gesso layer as a creative expression too. So in this one, I don't know if we can see it, but I've gotten a little more, I mean, I took the liberties to get a little more textured in these, sort of getting a little more impasto strokes in the highlights only. I wouldn't necessarily do that in the shadows at all. And that's just part of being true to nature. You know, when you look at a shadow, you don't see detail in there as compared to a highlight. And the highlight, that's where you see a bunch of texture or, you know, micro detail, whereas in the shadows, it sort of falls away from us. So we get to mimic nature with our brushwork in that way.
Now, there's this artist that we saw a bunch of his work in person in Chicago, Vasily Shelzenko, contemporary Russian guy. And, you know, he did this very kind of political figurative stuff. It's all very dark. And you didn't see a lot of the lighter values in the painting, but where he did the highlights, there was a lot of impasto. It was very built up. And you tended to see cast shadows, like real cast shadows within those highlights. Right. And it was such an effective, like, I mean, it just made those things pop and brought them into focus.
Right. Yeah, it's like a sculptural element to a painting that you can get away with. Dali called it, you know, to the point of opulence. You could get thick in your highlights, but the inverse is true. Your shadows should be that much more sort of immaterial and just both in terms of detail as well as in the physical paint application. It should be, you know, to create that illusion. We're playing with both polarities, and I know you've kind of talked about that in values, Guy, of like you could push your lights all the way up and your shadows all the way down, and so you have this, like, you know, enhanced spectrum on both sides.
Right, but if you have buildup in your shadows, that the topography of that paint buildup is going to pick up light.
Yeah,
you're going to see highlights in your shadows.
Right,
you want to avoid that. Yeah. Flat is better for that.
Exactly, and of course, like we say, all these kinds of, we can break all these rules certainly, but it's helpful to at least know them and kind of understand what makes a great, you know, what in theory makes a great painting in terms of the Western canon anyway.
Yeah, and you could say, okay, I could see a case where I would want a chunk of my shadow to stand out. And then boom, there you have an exception.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, it's just knowing, I think knowing these principles is really helpful. And I would repeat that my top three sort of parameters for an underpainting is values, getting your light and dark in the right place, transparency, so getting your highlights to be more opaque and your shadows to be more transparent, and then temperature, which is it comes through a little bit later, but it's that your highlights will be cooler in general and your shadows will be warmer in general. Even if, and we'll do a little color mixing exercise in a few moments here that kind of shows how we can play with that. And it does relate to tattoos as well. It is transferable, so it's kind of fun. Some of that relates to the idea we were talking about white as your brightest blue. White tends to read as a cool color wherever you place it. And you can really see that in this underpainting, like where I put the white, it almost starts to look like it's blue. Particularly compared to, it's optical, certainly, but just compared to how warm everything else is, pure white reads as a blue. So if we know that,
yeah, when I do highlights in my paintings, I almost always cut it with a little yellow because I'm trying to avoid that.
Exactly. Yeah, so just good to know how these colors read. We're not just dealing with the color out of the tube as it is. It's temperature in relation to everything else. So I guess what overpainting consists of, in a sense, or what we're looking at is we've got the dead layer underneath, and we're not trying to completely obliterate it. We're going to use transparent paints, at least semi-transparent paints. And so the terminology we use for that is glazing. So when I glaze something, it basically does this to it. You know, you could say, here's a glaze on top of my screen. You can still see most everything going on. It's a pretty dark one. I'll put a little lighter glaze on. This is a really subtle one, but you can see the temperature has changed. And so we're just affecting what's underneath without completely losing it, unless it's our desire to lose it. Here's the intermediate one. There we go. So that'd be kind of a nice glaze. For instance, in my shirt, the black shirt, but there's a little bit of information going on. When I glaze over it, it kind of just unifies those shadows even more. Or let's look right here. There's some different colors in the shadows, but when I glaze over it, it kind of unifies into one solid shadow mass. There's still some information there. So that's the effect of a glaze. It unifies everything underneath. It obscures some things, but you can still see the painting. You can still see the detail. You can still see the environment, my face. But everything gets a few shades darker. So that would be called a general glaze. If I am the painting that we're looking at, and I were to do this with paint, we'd call that a general glaze over the entire thing. And sometimes that's really useful. Let's say to invoke moonlight or the time of day that it is. If we've got too many different lights and darks, there's a lot of different, a lot of different information, and everything's looking too bright. Maybe it gets too light. And we want to push everything back and unify it. A glaze over the entire painting is a great way to do that.
I often find myself glazing gradients across my canvases.
Yeah.
I find that, it really would be nice to have the top fall back a little bit. So, it'll be like a hazing out that'll take the entire canvas, the entire length of the canvas to drop out.
Right. And some amazing color mixtures could come through that as well. If they glazed from your light source in a warmer color toward your, toward your shadows, there's sort of a warmer glaze. That's a great way to get some interesting color effects, optics that you could never mix. I mean, at this point, we could say, that I've got these browns going on. I know it's burnt sienna. And then once I add, a blue glaze to it, for instance, it's creating a degree of subtlety in some of those more mid-tone areas that would be not impossible, but difficult for me to mix on the palette and actually place correctly. So there's a layer of complexity that comes through the interaction of glazes, and optical mixtures is what we would call that, as opposed to palette mixtures. I often use glazing, at least general glazing, over the whole painting if I'm going to do that. In the mid stages of a painting, like I would do it now, we're going to kind of go for a finish move today. So I won't necessarily do this on this piece. It creates a longer dance back and forth to finish a painting. But I would tend to use it to unify things in the middle of a painting, and then start to identify local color in objects and separate them more after that. Some painters would use a glaze over the entire painting right at the end. And one example of this would be a seascape lit by a brilliant sun in the middle of the day. Maybe there's just a really subtle yellow glaze that goes over the whole thing, and it just sort of unifies disparate elements and says all of these things are within the envelope of that really bright sun. That'd be one use of a full general glaze as well. What we'll tend to do is more local glazing, more sort of picking area by area. Everything's very unified in these underpaintings. It's all in this brown scale, or it's all in this gray scale. It's very unified to begin with, and I'm going to start sort of pulling it apart and making things more individuated. But there's not really one way to go about that. I had made a kit. That's what these are from. These are just like photography gels, basically, that I found really useful to hold in front of a painting before I'm going to put a glaze on it, to try to figure out what color that's going to turn things. Looking at it, and I want to just understand what are the optical effects. This is very similar to what would happen with paint. And so you can find often at a paint store, you can order them like a whole book of little color swatches, and that can be extremely useful. Not doing too much, I'll start on the gray. It can be extremely useful before going full strength into a color you're not sure if it's going to work out right. Another way to play with that would be to get yourself some clear acetate, because these don't actually relate to pigments. These are CMYK calibrated. I got a series of these that I put into a toolkit that I made at one point. I don't have these anymore because they were too labor intensive to produce, but David Heskin's secret mixed technique glazing tools. And I made a whole little kit to teach my student, or to share with my students. But you could certainly buy a sheet of clear acetate and then take the actual paint that you're going to use and do color swatches, glazes on those, say with liquid, something that will dry quickly on there. Cut those apart and then use those so you know exactly this tube of paint is going to create exactly, exactly this look on your painting. And that could be really useful if you're learning the scope of what your paint is able to do. And depending
especially if you were trying to actually match something. Let's say you're trying to match somebody's skin tone, or you're trying to match eye color, or anything that's specific like that.
Right.
Take some of the guesswork out.
Absolutely. So yeah.
Everyone in the comments is very much interested in the glaze things that you were just showing. They're all like, yeah, tips. Wow.
Well, I would just say, look online, look for photography gels, and you can get a little, like for $8. They'll send you a whole set of, they're smaller, but they're meant to put over your flash or to put over your, per camera. So look into photography color gels, and for like $8, you can do yourself a world of good portrait. This was just my proprietary, ridiculous thing that I put together. There was more than just the gels in here. I had set up a whole series of these light gradients and imagery. Actually, I did this from a portrait because I was in the painting technique I was teaching. For instance, there was a portrait, and I would isolate sort of the general look of the portrait. Here, I would isolate the highlights, and I could put gel layers between these, overlay them, and see how about four to five layers of paint would interact for my students. So it's a really, the key way to get into it. But it was for a specific painting technique that was, kind of down the rabbit hole. So
yeah,
I told these for like $80. You can get for $8, you can get yourself a set of gels, no problem. Yeah, easy. Cool. Any other questions I should address in the chat yet, or are we good to go?
Oh gosh, I guess for the folks who are about getting ready to start, everyone's got their own reference and that sort of thing. I guess any advice on what mediums they should have handy and that kind of thing?
Sure. I think today we could just play with, if people have a cold pressed oil, I think we'll try to keep it mostly to just straight oil. We used our solvents last time in our underpainting layer to keep it thinner. This time just straight up oil. I've got a disposable palette and a very simple selection of colors, which will be the same as last time, just to show them. And that's ultramarine blue, Indian yellow, and a alizarin crimson, just 3 set of primaries that are transparent, and a titanium white. I'm keeping it rather simple. A palette knife, a paper towel, some brushes. We'll do a little exercise first, a little color mixing exercise before we get into actually painting on here. Just something that I like to show people. And other than that, keeping it really simple. I think that's sort of the name of the game for painting for me, is how much can you do with how little material? And it relies on our own color mixing prowess and these kind of layering techniques and what they can do for us. So rather simple. So I'll just pour out a palette and we'll get started. Right now the color mixing exercise we could do on a separate piece of, could be a panel or a separate piece of oil paper if you've got it. Some primed, preferably white, would be good to see what's going to happen with these colors. But just some spare piece of material. This is sort of like, I love color charts, actually. I'm really obsessed with color mixing charts. They're boring to do, certainly. They're not that fun, but you're so happy to have them later. Even if you don't look at them that much later, you learn so much by mixing color and just seeing the interactions of it. And a few suggestions for that might be, take 2 different blues or 3 different blues and 3 different reds and just mix them and see what kind of different colors they produce. And there's just so much information gained from that I could never, I could talk for hours, but you spending 2 minutes just mixing 2 different blues and 2 different reds and seeing the combinations, it's a sort of visceral experience you get from painting that no amount of reading books about color will ever give you. So some white at the bottom. So I can see it's really interesting to note that this yellow is already dripping oil out of the tube. It's probably the cheaper of the paints that I have right now, whereas the blue and the red, they're really just solid. And so that would relate to probably the quality of paint. The blue and the red are from Old Holland. These are beat up because they kind of travel all over, but Old Holland is known to be the most pigment rich paint. It's also the most expensive you can find at the art supply stores. It's not only expensive because of the name brand, it's expensive because of what you're getting. This tube is Gamblin Indian Yellow. Part of why the oil is dripping out may be due to the fact that Indian Yellow is actually, the modern version is not made from the urine of cows who have been force-fed mango leaves like it used to be in India, but is a modern color that starts out as a dye, and they're adding sort of solid bulking agents to it. So that may be why the oil is dripping out, or it may be because there's actually less pigment and more oil in it. So this is a cheaper paint just based on the amount of pigment that's in the tube. So these are interesting things to know. If you do have a paint that's too oily and you're wanting to get it to be stiffer, you can always pour your paint out onto a paper towel or onto a newspaper, and that oil will become absorbed into the newspaper and slowly dry out that blob of paint to where it can be a little stiffer. That's something to be able to affect. This is going to be a cheaper oil too. It's probably alkali refined linseed oil. It's going to be subject to a bit more yellowing over time. These are things that most people don't really care about, but it's interesting to note anyway. So our color mixing exercise is going to be really simple, and part of this is I want to show the effect, the difference between glazing and mixing with white. Like sometimes we might want a mid-tone red or a light blue, and there's a few ways to get there in painting. One is to glaze with that blue, and one is to mix that blue with white to be the color we want it to be the value that we want it to be. So those are going to be two completely different results. And we often take it for granted that thinking it will be the same. If I use blue thinly or if I mix with white, it's the same thing. And I think, well, this color mixing exercise is designed to show us exactly that is not quite the case. So I'm going to put some blue right onto I'm taking it off the palette and putting it right onto this oil paper surface. And I like doing this with a palette knife. You could do it with a brush, but you end up washing your brush so much in a turp tank that the brush ends up being muddied with color, or you end up using 50 different brushes. And no one likes washing brushes. So I just like to use a palette knife as much as I can for some of these exercises, because you just wipe it off and good to go. So I'm doing 2 piles of each color to start. I'm going to use this little dish for now and put a little bit of oil in it. And again, I'm using slightly thickened oil because I'm a total oil snob, but you can use whatever you like. One thing to note in oils, just a quick mention, this is some thickened linseed. It still has a bit of yellowness to it. There's a touch of color. It shouldn't affect the pigmentation too much. A lighter oil would be walnut oil, but it's slower drying. And then the lightest would be poppy oil. Dali reserved poppy oil for his brightest highlights, for the carnations and the swan down and things like that. He would use poppy oil because it doesn't yellow at all. But it's also the slowest drying. It dries exceedingly slow. I mean, if patience is not your strong suit, I would not use poppy oil. However, thickening the oil, as I mentioned, just like this, putting it in a dish and leaving it out, whether in the sun or otherwise, will start to thicken an oil, and it will begin that drying process. Oils begin to oxidize by pulling in oxygen from the air, by keeping it in sealed bottles, we're keeping it from doing that. So when you leave it out, it's starting to dry. So this can help our paints dry faster. Like I would say in that example of the phthalo blue, you know, you could make your paint dry a lot faster if you were using a sun thickened oil or just a thickened oil, because we're not waiting for it to pull in all that oxygen from the environment. That's part of why I like thickened oils as well.
But yeah, the thickness of it in that dish, I mean, it's what, like 3-4 millimeters deep at least.
Yeah.
And so you would need to have that much oil buildup in your painting to have that much yellow.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's almost crystal clear when you like, you know, when it's a thin layer, for sure. Sun also bleaches the oil a bit, so I'm a huge fan. All the old masters were kind of knew what this stuff was, and in using it, I really get it. There's an amazing, I don't know, like you use cold pressed oil and it can get a bit slippery, right? You're just pushing things around. You're sort of skating around on oil, and this, it really doesn't do that. It fuses a lot better. The colors will melt into each other a lot better. And there's no one right viscosity to get a thickened oil to. I used to think the thicker the better, and at a certain point, you're like, oh, that's actually way too thick to use. You get it like molasses or honey or something, and it's just, then you have to thin it with turpentine again. So it's an interesting dance. It's an interesting chemistry. Something
like stand oil.
Stand oil. I cannot stand that stuff. The thing with stand oil, and we see this in the art supply stores, the art supply stores like to bottle things and sell it to us at a premium. Stand oil is oil that's been thickened through heat in the absence of oxygen. So what that means, it's heat bodied and it gets really dark, you know, that really intensely like golden amber color. But it's been heat bodied in absence of oxygen. Oxygen is what is helping the oil to dry faster. It's that oxygenation process that begins polymerizing the oil. So you have a thick oil that dries painfully slow because it hasn't actually started to drink in the oxygen yet. And because it's such a thick oil, it takes it a long time to actually pull oxygen all the way through those films. So I feel like, you know, stand oil, yeah, you see it a lot in these 20th century art manuals. They used stand oil, terps, and varnish, basically. And that was kind of their solution to getting that gloss. Thickened oils impart more gloss than thinner oils. Stand oil, for sure, gives a lot of gloss to your painting, but at the detriment of drying time.
Yeah, and it's also just heavy to work with.
Yeah, straight out of the
yeah, the molasses effect.
Yeah, I mean, unless you mix it with a solvent, there's really not much to do with it other than catch flies. I think is pretty much what it's good for.
You don't have opinion about that at all, do you?
Nope.
All right, so we got our 2 blobs of each color.
Cool. So first I'm going to, since I have a sun thickened oil, I'm doing this vertical as well. You could do this flat, but since I'm doing it vertical, another reason I'm using a sun thickened oil, I'm basically putting a blob of oil to the side of my paint, and with the palette knife, I'm working up into one of those blobs. So I'm kind of saturating it with oil, and then I'm sort of smashing it back down. I'm making a gradient is ultimately what's happening. Using the white of the paper, of the oil paper, or your panel, or whatever you want to use as your highlight, and then just sort of drawing a full gradient out of the paint. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's just to give an idea of what this paint is going to do in a glaze, what it's used from its full body color on the top. I'm letting there be a little thick paint there. And how that color kind of opens up. It gets a little more brilliant as I'm pulling it out of its dense body color form. You can see the full range of what's capable with a glaze of that color straight by itself. The next swatch over, I'm going to put a blob of white where I had put that dollop of oil. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm kind of I'm not going to touch this other pile if I can. I just want to get it really close because we're going to do a color comparison, a temperature comparison in this case. So I'm sort of walking the titanium white up a little bit toward the paint, toward the blue, this ultramarine in this case. Might wipe off the palette knife and go right into the blue and start to sort of pull that down into the white. I'm seeing if I can just do a mixture, a gradient all the way, and I might have to go back and forth a little bit. Leave that excess on my palette if I have too much on the palette knife and I don't want to get rid of. Go back into the top of that body color blue a little more and get a little more smooth gradient there. And what I'm trying to prove through this, and you can prove to yourself in front of you, I don't know how much it's going to translate through the computer, is not only the slight difference in transparency, which we would expect. With the glaze, it's going to be more transparent, the one on the inside here, versus titanium white, which is more opaque. But there's a temperature difference between the two that's very evident. Even within ultramarine blue, the color swatch mixed with white is decidedly cooler, more pastel, not only lighter, but also cooler. This one. Whereas when I've just mixed with oil in the glaze and pulled it out, it's warmer. So that's a really interesting distinction. Even within a single color, we could make a blue, we could find, I want a medium blue. I have two options to get there. Would I like that to be slightly cooler, like a sky blue, or slightly warmer, maybe this sort of oceanic blue? And these are subtle distinctions, but they help us understand the difference between glazing and scumbling, which would be the opposite, like adding these sort of semi opaque layers on top of our painting. There are temperature implications as well as opacity implications. I'm going to do the exact same thing for my red and for my yellow.
Yeah, I'm seeing a huge difference with the red.
Yeah,
yeah.
We've got Damon in the comments wondering, how long do you leave the oil in the sun for?
It depends where you live. It really depends where you live and how thick you put the oil in the dish. And there's no one answer. There's really no answer. This is sort of one of those experiential things that you get to build a relationship. A week in the sun will do something. I had some of this oil I left out from our first painting session, and it started to thicken a touch, within the 2 weeks between then and now. Might not get that much thicker, but it should be noticeable. Go from just like a superfluid into something a little stickier. But there's just no one answer, and I guess that's kind of what I'm getting at with some of this is you have to do it and build that relationship and see what happens. I definitely encourage that. See what happens. It might not take much to change the properties, the working properties of your oil completely. Yeah, you see it a lot in the red, as Guy said. Suddenly you go from...
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of the difference between a warm pink to a cool magenta.
Yeah, it's light red or pink, and those are two different things entirely, aren't they? Like, yeah, really cool to see that. And you can do this with any color, certainly. And maybe I'll even do it with a mixed neutral as well, but we'll do it with these three primaries first. It's just fun to prove to yourself. This, in a way, we were saying it, that white behaves like the brightest blue. And you can hear that all day long. And then when you see it, you go, ah, right. I mix white with my red, and suddenly I don't have light red, I have pink. Or have, whatever you want to term these colors. It gets to where words don't do it justice anymore, and it's just about the experience of these colors. Like, how can you have a cold yellow? It's so weird because yellow seems to be this really warm color. And then you mix white with it and you can suddenly see that there's a way to make your yellow more cold. It's like there's a way to make your blue more warm, like glazing it.
Well, I definitely noticed when, like early in tattooing, that if I was making a flame and, I was going to yellow at the tip and then I put a white highlight there, it always seemed like it canceled out some of the heat.
Yep. And there you go. That's why I think this relates exactly to tattooing. And the question is, what is the temperature of our light source? If we're using white and we know that white acts as a blue, that means our light source is actually cold if we're going to use white as our brightest light. Otherwise, you might want to use, in painting, it's a little easier. Tattooing, maybe you could pull it off still, but much easier in painting. Let's say you put a white highlight on a tip of a flame and went, oh, it just turned, like you just said, it just turned it cold. All I would do is wait for that paint to dry and come back over it with a yellow glaze and very
the
light,
tiniest amount,
tiny bit, and glaze over that white, and suddenly you've got that heat back. So that's sort of one of the benefits of layered painting. If you end up needing to push your highlights, let's say in a painting, really bright with white, but it actually destroyed the color effect, that if you had a warm light source, just let it dry, come back and glaze over it, and then we can really have a lot more control over our temperatures.
right? And that's something that, as you get more and more practice with your painting, you'll be able to step back and say, yeah, it looks just a little dull here and here. It's like, well, yeah, it's not warm enough, or it's not cool enough. It's something has caused that particular element to not match up with everything else. And like you were saying about that kind of general glazing, you might not even need to do that, but with practice, you'd be able to step back and say, I just need to glaze a tiny bit of yellow right through there, and it'll just lock in with everything else and become seamless.
Exactly. It's one thing to know that you can always unify disparate elements in a painting with a glaze. And this is sort of how I stumbled on glazing early on in my painting days. I would be painting a whole scene, whatever it would be, and things just felt like they were from different worlds. Like one thing would be too blue, or too, like, I don't know, just not rich enough, or some things. It's like they weren't in the same painting. And so instead of trying to mix those exact colors again, I found I would just mix a glaze and put it over all of that, and then start to paint out from that into the wet paint from that unified glaze. So when we're thinking glazing, it's often a unifying element. So we're always pushing and pulling, unifying things and then separating things. Like pure unity is just, if it's 100% unified, you just have this white of your paper and that's it, nothing to do. Things being too separate, you end up with just full, chromatically slappy paintings, that are like too bright and have nothing, the colors have nothing in common with each other, which there are uses for that, certainly. Full bright color, absolutely. It's really striking on the eye.
Well, and if I can make a tattooing comparison here, for example, let's say the kind of thing I do, there's a warm light source somewhere in there, and I've got a number of surrounding elements that might be of various different materials. Let's say some metallic, some organic, and some atmosphere, right? But I want to bring everything together. So towards the end of the session, I will usually then, let's say if it's a warm light source, I'll dip into a yellow, and I'll very lightly skim over pretty much every surface that's pointing towards that light source. Yeah. Whatever color is already there. If it's ochre, it'll become a little yellower. If it's a steely blue-gray, it'll just warm up a little bit. If it's a pinkish background, it'll just gain enough heat to lock it in with everything else. And it's just a few very, very quick brush strokes, but that's all it takes.
Absolutely. So that would be the terminology in painting we'd use for that would be local glazing. You're just coming across to those areas and imparting the temperature of the light source to it. Absolutely.
So really, talking about temperature, it's not really about color at all. What we're talking about here, yeah, we're using color to achieve temperature, but you're trying to unify your elements in a composition by making sure that they are reacting to the same temperature of light and shadow.
Exactly. And we know basically from observing light, or at least humans have known for a long time, that the color wheel really comes into play. If your highlight is yellow, and we're moving, if this is, it's just a color triangle at the moment, well, it'll be more of a wheel in a moment. But if my highlight is yellow, my shadows in general are going to be the opposite of yellow. So the blue and red mix would give a violet of some kind. You know, we look to Impressionism to really understand this. One, they had a lot of amazing new colors that emerged in the mid 1800s, and it sort of allowed Impressionism to exist at all. These mineral colors, manganese violets and phthalo blue, and you know, a lot of these really incredible colors came out. But the scientific awareness of color vibration was also happening at that time. So instead of the brown, like the Renaissance brown paintings that we think of, kind of like what we started here, with this extremely limited traditional palette, the Impressionists decided they were not painting form and applying color to form, they were painting light. So they really honed in on if that evening sunset light source color was this golden nectar, sort of yellow orange, then all the shadows of, let's say, the trees in their scene would be this blue violet. They had no choice but to be opposite the color wheel, and they just painted it as such. Even if in nature it was looking more subtle to the eye. It was sort of a twist of the mind to think in terms of light and color instead of thinking in terms of mass. So we're in the modern age, we can do whatever we want. We can hybridize those. We can do all kinds of different things. So it's really kind of a fun to look at different ways of thinking about color. I did mix a chromatic neutral. I call it chromatic black. It might not be black per se. It might be slightly more brown. It might be slightly more any direction of these colors. I mean, it's more of a range. It's more of a realm of neutral that we get to dabble in and play with, that I find really interesting. This is where a lot of subtlety happens. In the screen, it just looks black. It's just dark. Maybe you can feel a little warmth right there. And I want to do the exact same thing, but I would take our three primaries, mix something in the middle that looks generally pretty neutral. It's still very red in mine, but I'll add a little more blue to it. The pigments are all different strength too. You know, one thing to note is just because you add equal amounts of paint to a mixture doesn't mean they're going to behave the same way. This Indian yellow is a beast, so strong, and the alizarin is so strong, even compared to phthalo blue, which is normally a total beast. Some of these are, you know, I'm having to add more blue in order to try to get this to neutralize in the middle.
Well, and to, you know, again, to make a tattooing comparison, certain pigments, in particular magenta and green concentrate, they're incredibly translucent. So if you're layering those on top of stronger colors, like the blues and purples, they're going to be having a minority decision in what you're actually going to see there.
Like that, a minority decision. Yeah, they're there, but they're not weighing in very heavily on the conversation. So same thing, I'm doing these backwards now because I put the oil in the wrong spot, but I'm just gonna do the same thing with the oil and the white that I did with these three first color swatches. Even within a neutral, nice smoky black. So I'm sort of pulling that out into my oil, into a little glaze, seeing the capacities of this color to impart its value on a situation. And then same thing with the white. I'm going to put this, walk up the white into toward that color swatch, and then I'll wipe off my palette knife and start right in that black and pull it back down. This is a mixed black again. You could do this, you can see this with like ivory black as well. I mean, you could do straight out of the tube black and see this same phenomenon happen. This temperature difference, I can see it even on the tiny swatch, but I'll show you closer. That temperature difference, how much colder the one is mixed with white. And I think we can see this, the difference between, in tattoo for sure, the difference between a gray wash and an opaque gray, you know, it's very different. In painting, it's even more pronounced, I think, but I do believe these are applicable, you know, to tattoo as well. No question.
Yeah, right as you said that about the, you know, paints not being equal strength. I was mixing Payne's gray with this sort of, I don't know what it is. It's an Old Holland sort of King's Blue Deep, it's called, but it's a very soft color and quickly overwhelmed by the tiniest amount of paint. It's great.
Yeah. Absolutely. So this is just, I would suggest, you know, for people learning oil painting, do this with as many colors as you can stand to and as many mixtures as you can stand to. And here's two different similar blacks right out of my mixture. This one had slightly less blue in it, and then I added a touch more blue. Subtle differences, but really what we're getting at is seeing the, you know, seeing how much these colors can work for us to find a lot of subtlety in the middle. This is sort of
translucent versus opaque is very different.
Yeah, absolutely. And I find it just opens up the language of these colors. I mean, we're so conditioned to think in just very remedial terms about color, like, you know, blue, red, and yellow. Like, those are just the extremes. There's so much subtlety, and it's kind of what I want to do with this palette in a way, is mix a little bit of this neutral that we've mixed out toward the red, and do a mixture where that red is mixed half and half with that chromatic black. Clean my palette knife every time, and I'll take that black and put it partway toward the yellow and do the same thing. And this is sort of giving us our color gamut, you know, that like, what are these colors capable of in mixture together? And I often like to use a really big, like, glass palette, for instance. You can get a lot more color swatches going on that way. And quickly see how the black has sort of taken over that yellow, but I'm actually going to do the same thing. I'm going to make a color swatch with that. Often in their dense body color state, and by that I mean when they're mixed on the palette, or when they're in blobs still, it's very difficult to see the characteristics of the paint. It's very difficult to see what color it's going to be. It just looks dark when you're using these transparent colors. So I'll do the same test, do the same thing with my oil and my titanium white. And it's really just looking at what are these color mixtures capable of. That's still a yellow, but it's definitely getting more into these kind of smoky, brownish, greenish, interesting tones come out of it. I'll do the same thing with the white.
So yeah, I remember being in art class in junior high and having access to the paint room where there were all these shelves of paint. And I was surprised to find something that was called dark yellow. I was like, what the heck? And I open it up and it's like, this is just brown, right? But why don't you explain the difference?
Wow. Well, I would imagine that the difference is that it was probably a transparent yellow, would be my guess. Like this Indian yellow on my palette does not look like the canary yellow, the sort of like bright yellow we think of. It doesn't even look like that. Like this luminosity. It's a transparent color, so when it's in a blob there, light is not able to permeate through it and back out to our eye like it is here. Here's a very thin layer, light's going in, bouncing off of that white, highly reflective white layer and back to our eye, and we're able to see. I mean, this is my guess about a dark yellow. I mean, that yellow does kind of neutralize into browns in a way, but that it might have just meant a transparent yellow versus an opaque, like a cadmium, like canary yellow, really bright. And it actually takes transparency in order to sort of wake up the potential of that yellow. That's my guess about what they might have been meaning in your class there. Here's my yellow mixture with the chromatic black, and suddenly, like, in painting, like, wow, if that's my yellow, what a lot of personality to that.
Right.
Like, it suddenly got a lot of character to it.
Well, so this tube here from Old Holland. So the packaging on Old Holland tubes, is it actually, do they use some of the actual paint on the tube? Because it seems to be flaking off, as, you know, like it's not just a print job to pretend to be the paint. Yeah, but this looks like it got brushed on with some translucence. I don't know if you can see that here, but you know, this, you know, you can see the brush mark, so you can actually get a real idea of how it's going to act.
Yeah, The
So
actual
Old Holland
swatch,
gold green.
actual swatch is there. And usually on the tubes, they'll say there'll be some indication of transparency, like on this Indian yellow on Gamblin on the back, it does say it's transparent. Sometimes there's a little code system that paint makers like to give for that. Old Holland, it doesn't tell you, but they'll often at art supply stores give you if you ask for a color chart for different brands, whichever you like, they'll give you a brochure, and you can open it up and see all the different colors that the manufacturer makes, as well as there's often a little color coding system that tells you if they're opaque, transparent, semi-opaque, semi-transparent, and I would say most colors fall into the semi-something zone, meaning it's not going to cover completely necessarily, but it's also not as transparent as this Indian yellow is. So it's just good to know, and it can save you a lot of time to do these kind of tests, because you'll very quickly find out the difference between an opaque color and a transparent one. If you're using an opaque color, trying to do what I just did with the oil and get this soft gradient, you won't end up with a gradient at all. You'll just end up with one big patch of red, say, and that would be like Indian red, English red, Mars red or Mars violet, Caput Mortem violet. That's all iron oxide pigments, and they're just opaque. I mean, you can thin them enough to get them transparent, but it takes a lot of work, and you're kind of better off finding if you're trying to use a red in a transparent way, better off using a transparent color to begin with. Otherwise, you might have, like Guy was saying, oil sort of leaking out of a painting, and the colors are just so rich these days anyway. I mean, to use more kind of like dead opaque colors, that would be useful for our underpainting. That would be useful for this dead layer. Even if it's not totally gray, even if you wanted to hint at the color, let's say this was red velvet in the background, I could hint at that in the underpainting with a more opaque red. And then in my overpainting, I would be inclined to use a more brilliant red on top. And that's a pretty classical technique as well, using a slightly more dead, flatter, duller color underneath, and then really pop it with a transparent color. And same goes in reverse. If I'm just trying to use this transparent color in my underpainting, it's going to take so long to build that up. And I'm going to have to add white to it, and then it changes the whole nature of the color anyway. So there's a real usefulness in learning which of our pigments and our paints are opaque, which are transparent, and learning their behaviors. All color's not just color.
Yeah.
Yeah, color's not just color. It actually has characteristics as well. So yeah, you can kind of keep going with this. I'll mix a few more little swatches and kind of finish up this exercise as I see what other neutrals are available. I'll do my red swatch here. Pick the red neutral. Kind of see what comes out of it. This is informing me as to some of the colors that I might try to bring into my underpaintings. Even though dead color underneath and we've neutralized, we mixed a black in order to make a gray underpainting. It doesn't mean I'm just going to come back on top of this with full strength yellow and full strength red and blue, because it's going to be neutralized from below. I still want to have some sensitivity in the overpainting. We can clobber it. We call it chroma slapping, when your eyeballs just like laugh it out of your head because there's too much color in a painting.
Yeah.
Sometimes you want that, but it's sort of like the term that's used is like, it's violent opposition. If you're trying to invoke a sense of violence in your painting, then by all means, put a couple of really opposing colors right next to each other in your painting. But if you're trying to get them to harmonize and you're trying to have things feel like they're part of one environment, having some kind of shared, something in common between them is really key. And the commonality that I'm positing for this between these three wildly divergent colors is their common mixture. They're a chromatic neutral that blends, that was made from all three of them, contains each of them. Now they're, we call it the universal translator. Like, this will now harmonize any color that I want to bring into my composition. I can mix a little bit of this neutral with it, and it will suddenly be speaking the language that the other colors are speaking a lot better. But we'll get to that. We'll get to that in practice.
So yeah, let's make another tattooing comparison. You're talking about earlier paintings of yours where you felt like, the elements were, each one was just its own color scheme, but they didn't all come together. And I think it's very easy to fall into that with a tattoo, especially, let's say, an illustrative tattoo where you've got a number of different elements that have, a fair amount of rendering, shading, color, different details. And they might stand out from each other strongly, and you want to have that, at least some of that graphic strength, so the thing reads nicely. But then, that lack of unification, and so that's where we have to get away from coloring book kind of coloring, where it's like, okay, so this is the face, so I'm going to use just flesh tones in the face, and this is the crown that she's wearing, so I'm just going to use gold colors in the crown, and here's the background, and my background color. You learn to bring some of that gold into the face and some of the background into the gold, and that all these things are in real life going to be interacting with each other. And so by mimicking some of that interaction in your art, it just makes it all make sense. I can imagine a movie that was done on a green screen and they don't really like match the lighting of the actors with the lighting of the scene they're putting them in. You can tell at a glance.
Right, it's not very convincing illusion, basically. It's kind of,
and in fact, I'm sure in film they probably have like a glaze layer that they put over everything.
Filters for sure.
Unite it. Yeah, they'll filter the whole thing with a certain color to make sure that it all snaps together.
I was watching particularly in period films, you can see it. There'll be like a yellow, a brown or a yellow glaze over everything. Watch a Jean-Pierre Jeunet movie, that filmmaker. It's like, everything's kind of a yellow for him. Super fun, but it creates mood as well. I mean, it's not only relegated to technical unification. There's also a lot of mood and kind of emotion that we can bring into a painting that way, or into a tattoo that way. The atmospheric envelope is one way of thinking about it. It's like the color of the day affects everything. The color of the light source, if you're living in the Pacific Northwest, where it's sort of like rainy all the time and gray, everything is tinted a bit gray. So here I've just done a few more neutrals. There's my neutral red, a lot more neutral than this full strength red, brought out to the glaze and the white. Here's my neutral blue. I'm really liking it. It's kind of like slate color suddenly.
Yeah, really nice color, just a little bit purplish.
Yeah, and that's just blue mixed with my chromatic black. And, here was my yellow. So suddenly, there's it's almost like autumn colors that are coming out. And they're really a bit more moody. They're a little less full strength, sort of happy. They're a little more brooding. I'm not quite sure what they're up to, but a lot more subtlety. And so these have, like this bottom row, basically, all these colors are unified with the combination of the top three. So all of these could go together really nicely in a painting next to each other and not have any violent opposition. This is my yellow, my red, and my blue. They could work right next to each other and all still, they contain a seed that's the same. Whereas these next to each other are going to provide, it might be the effect we want. There's no judgment, but these are going to provide a lot more striking opposition to each other, whereas these are harmonizing. I mean, you could go on literally forever with this and make endless color swatches between these. I've just made sort of a middle ground red mixed with my black, a middle ground yellow mixed with my black, and same with the blue. But you could draw those out into 5 or 7 or 9 color swatches and get these very subtle gradations of color information there. And in a way, it's something just really worth doing. And, sometimes you just don't feel like painting, but you do want to mess with paint, or you don't quite, maybe your painting's drying and you want to be in that mindset. I think that doing these kinds of color charts is so indispensable. I have stacks of them. And I think you could even make cool paintings out of a color chart. You could decide how you're going to, say, a mandala, for example, or something geometric would be an easy place to start. Or even, maybe a biomac piece where you say, I'm gonna mix these colors and just slowly gradate them throughout a piece and watch what happens. I think there's a lot.
Have foreground elements where you only use opaque variations, background elements where it's all translucent variations.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's a lot to play with, and you know,
Well,
each of
I think that I might do that with my painting today.
yeah.
So, do you find that opaque finishes tend to pop out from translucent backgrounds more?
That's it. That is exactly what we're getting at with some of this. And let's see, which one will we start on? That's exactly the nature of these colors, is that you know, we're mimicking light, and we're mimicking the way we see light. And shadows, they just, in their lack of detail and in their lack of brilliance, they fall away from us in our field of vision. And things that are solid, that are catching the direct light and bouncing that right to our eye, tend to jump forward and become, you know, not only dimensional and more opaque in our vision, we can see a lot more detail in them. So we're playing with those parameters. More detail and more opacity is going to jump forward, and less detail and more transparency is going to push way back into the distance. So that is exactly what we want to play with on top of these underpaintings. So the strategy I would dive into with that is noticing how much of our composition is foreground and how much of it is background. And in this, you know, like I would say probably it's pretty even, but probably more like 2/3 of my composition is background, and about 1/3 of it is popping forward. So regardless of how much or how it works, the natural way we want to build a painting in this case is sort of back to front. And this might be sort of opposite of how you paint a lot of the time, Guy, where you kind of hit your highlights and then sort of flow out from there so as not to muddy them. Because we're painting in layers, we have the ability to sort of deal with each, you know, if our highlight gets muddied, we're going to let it dry and come back and put it there again later. So in a way, this is sort of an opposite technique where we're going to build our painting like sculpturally back to front. So the way I would approach this is, first thing is I'm going to assess my entire background. It's such a massive area too. The logic I would want to impart here is moving from general to specific, meaning deal with the biggest thing first, because that's going to inform all the little stuff. And one way to think about this is, say, like you were just talking about how you would reflect colors from your background into a face or into a crown or into these subject matters. If you paint the face first, fully, render a beautiful portrait, and then you go and paint your background, you might recognize that they actually don't fit, that face needed to have a lot more of that background color reflected in it to make sense in that world. So it's sort of like putting the bigger context in first and then moving toward the details. So that's what I'll do in this. I'm almost thinking before we do that, maybe it'll be, you know, we're an hour, almost hour and a half in, to give people a little 5-minute break if they want to kind of adjust and reassess their setup. I'm going to mix a few more colors on here to give myself the full color wheel as well. Right now, I've just got those 3 primaries and a black. I'm going to mix secondaries, mix an orange, mix a green, and mix a violet, and mix secondary, you know, these chromatic black with those. So I'll have just sort of a full gamut of what my color palette can do. And I may even mix some white into some of those so that we can start to see, I mean, color is really 3-dimensional. It's almost impossible it is impossible to see its full capacity within a 2-dimensional palette. There's just no way. And there's some good models for that. If you look up color sphere, there's some great examples of that. Just the complexity of color space that we're actually dealing with.
Right. Yeah. It's the color wheel is a vast oversimplification.
It really is. It really is. And yet the languaging we use for color is so bound to that. It's that, like, you know, people go, what color is that? Oh, blue. Well, yeah, sure. Could we be a little more specific than that? Definitely.
Yeah. And, you know, of course, people aren't, you can't tell them, you know, it's Pantone number such and such either, you know, so it's a tough thing to put into words if you're trying to get more specific than a certain, you know, degree. And you know, one thing I'm trying to avoid doing today is just simply mix my two main elements colors. You know, I've got my hand here and I've got my background. So it'd be real easy to just mix a background color and mix some flesh tones, but I'm going to try to avoid doing that and just work with this, you know, the same palette that you're working with right now, and just address light and shadow for what it is and not think about what these elements are.
Totally. There's different ways to think about this, and the more layers we give ourselves for this, I mean, this will be kind of a cut to the chase. I mean, it will be, yeah, a little bit. We want to just address local colors. If we were doing many layers, sort of infinite amount of layers, there's a lot of ways we can play, and one of those might be just addressing your highlight color and your shadow color, and then glazing the entire thing. Like for right now, if my highlight was going to be yellow, I would glaze the entire thing, maybe this entire painting, in a violet in the shadow color. Flip it to the opposite. That way I know my shadows are in place and I'm going to build toward the light from there. Granted, I'd probably not be finishing that in one shot, because if I have all these violets where I know I'm going to put yellows, it's going to be muddy. So that's why we need this layered process. So we're going to kind of hybridize and lean into that logic while still trying to come out the other end with, you know, something that could be nearing its final look, at least in certain areas.
Yeah, a little bit more of a compact process.
Yeah, I mean, indirect painting can really be infinite, and it's as far as you want to take it. So I'm, you know, hesitant to draw it out to too many deep conclusions. You know, often this would happen in, say, like a 3-week seminar, or at least a week-long class where that would sort of play out with that many layers. You know, we may get to that. We'll see. I mean, I teach a lot of those, or have been, changing a little bit these days. It's much easier to do those in person. So I kind of wanted to just look at what we could do online, what we could do in this medium that would give people something to work with. And you know, I did say, and even in the other classes I'm teaching online, it's not so much completion based. This is not how to get, you know, not how to paint an apple and make it look perfectly realistic. This is a lot of food for thought that requires unpacking.
Yeah, here's some tools for you. Now you're going to need to do stuff with them.
Yeah, go check this out for a year or two and see what happens. Okay. Mixing my secondaries, I basically got.
And one thing that I.
Go ahead.
No, you go first.
Okay, just real quick, I mixed the secondaries. I mixed my red and my yellow. You know, we think orange, and this does not look like standard orange because these are transparent colors. I mixed the yellow and the blue, got a green, mixed the red and blue, and I've got a violet. I mixed each of those with that chromatic black in the middle, just to give myself a bit of a, you know, a bit of an alphabet of different options I can start to make different mixtures with.
Yeah, I like this stage of glazing because I'm not always going for a perfectly smooth airbrush finish. You know, I did airbrush, you know, early in my life, and it was fun. But when I was ready to put it down, I was ready to put it down, and I like brush character, you know. But at this stage, you really have a chance to layer it in such a way that you can see how it develops, and you can push and pull. I like the pushing and pulling. Something that's a little harder to do with the tattoo medium, you know, where you can say, okay, I'm going to go a little softer, maybe a little bolder, maybe a little softer, until everything clicks together in a way that reads nicely, you know, across the whole composition.
Yeah, oils are intensely forgiving. You know, if you mess it up, just redo it, take it off. There's a lot of painters, like classical painters, even they'll put all their paint on for the day and they're kind of like, oh, it's a bit thick, and they'll just like take a palette knife and scrape off, like that still goes into the weave of their canvas, but they'll like kind of scrape off the excess, knowing that it's not done. And it's sort of, yeah, it's interesting. Like there's not a one way of having a finished painting. There's not one way it's supposed to look, and there's not one way the process needs to play out either. It's really more of a journey than a destination, you know. So much more trying to keep myself interested in the process and make it mean something. You know, and that's a whole other kind of way of thinking about painting, is the symbology that these colors represent, or that, you know, it's vast.
Yeah, what you're personally putting into it.
Absolutely, because that's it. At the end of the day, it's, you know, the painting is a painting, and you can sell it, and that's great. But this is a true opportunity for self-mastery. I mean, I think is not to be overlooked. Painting is not just something that some random people did as a hobby for thousands of years. This is like a true pathway. Like anything.
Yeah, I've confused the Jehovah's Witnesses at my door. You know, they ask you your religion. Tell them artist. They won't know what to say. There's nothing in their guidebook for that.
Nice one. Absolutely. So I know some people that will mix a palette, and they'll literally mix like 70 or 80 color swatches on their, like a big glass slab, like I was mentioning, before they even start a painting, because there's so much information there. And some of those might be, like, I've mixed all these different colors. I've got, it looks, you know, around the outside, I've got my primaries and secondaries, and I've even mixed some tertiaries, which means like I had my red and yellow to make an orange, and then I mixed between yellow and that orange to make a yellow orange, a yellow green, a blue violet, a red violet, kind of gone around. But then each of those, you could take a separate mixture and mix some of that with white. I mean, and then how much white? Maybe you want to do 3 or 4 mixtures with white. Like, there's really not enough room on the palette to explore every color mixture we might want to do, but it at least gives a sense of the nature of these mixtures. So I'm mixing white with a few just to see it, just to see how it reacts, because I'm never, as much as I even know what it will probably do, it's different than actually seeing it. And then maybe holding up on my palette knife to my painting and understanding how it's going to act there. The map, and then there's the territory. So getting into the territory.
Yeah, I love the discovery process though of glazing, because, you know, like this sort of you know, sienna underpainting that we did 2 weeks ago. I'm just really loving how it's combining with this. You know, I made this very dull green because I'm just resting my hand on this table surface, which is this kind of pool table green kind of color. And I'm just watching how that's mixing and interacting with the underpainting. And, you know, being a colorblind guy, I don't really care about accuracy. I'm just trying to make something look nice, you know. And so the way that it comes together with a little bit of randomness is something I really enjoy. I know that I probably feel differently if I were trying to match something perfectly, in which case then, you know, that's when you get into those gels and things like that.
And I think, gosh, even the thought of mixing it perfectly, I think it so much comes down to the nature of perception. Like we were mentioning, the Impressionists would gauge an apple so much differently than a classical realist, you know, like a Renaissance painter. And we could say they were both correct. And I think it just comes down to our nature of perception, certainly, as an individual, you know, colorblindness or not, because I'm right there with you, you know, pretty intensely. And it's more about the experience of the painting, or the experience of the paint as it makes a composition, more than it is some idea that there's an empirical scientific, you know, we're not making a photograph, we're making a painting. And yeah, it's not to be overlooked, I think.
Okay, so you've got color limitations that, you know, probably red, green, right? I think that for me, that's one of the reasons why I've always enjoyed thinking so clearly in terms of warm and cool, you know, temperature. And because even if I know I'm seeing everything differently from people with normal vision. I think that this warm and cool thing is going to translate across.
Exactly.
Where, you know, something that I'm very reluctant to do is make red gradients that, you know, fade into other colors, because I know I see red so differently from the way other people see red.
Right.
I think I see it darker than most. And so it's not going to be a good gradient. You know, it's going to look different to me than it does to other people. So when I use red in my tattoos, I tend to isolate it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just knowing what you're working with, and that, you know, that's a strength right there to understand. I think everyone sees 100% differently. Some more similar to each other, but the spectrum, absolutely. Actually, I've seen at some point. I'll try to show you send you the scientific sort of diagrammatic way of explaining what color blindness is on a color chart. It's really interesting on a spectral chart. It was really interesting to kind of understand it from that way, because you of course still see red, you of course still see green, but how is it different, and in what ways are the frequencies different? It's really intriguing. Really interesting.
Well, and you know, I don't know if you have the same experience, but certain reds, I think I probably see as brightly as other people, you know, while other reds are very dull and, you know, like brown to my vision.
Yeah.
Some are very vibrant.
I could mimic I'll mimic the color spectrum just to give you an idea of it. But let's say here's a roll of tape, and this is our color spectrum with, you know, blues, you know, yellows, reds. And granted, it was mapped in the 1900s with a flat bottom, and they mapped it in a certain way. But the color blindness was lines going through the spectrum, originating from a certain point that cut through the wavelengths like this, all across that color spectrum. So if the red is more where my finger is, you'd have more of those red areas cut through, whereas fewer of the blues would be cut through and fewer of the yellows would be cut through. So it was an interesting way to say, like, these are areas of invisibility. So you can still see there's still reds that shine through on this, you know, on the proverbial tape roll of color, but more of them would be blocked, and fewer of the blue frequencies, say was up here, would be blocked, and fewer of the yellow frequencies down here would be blocked. That was just an interesting way that they visualized it in the 1930s, I think.
Yeah, and of course it's an oversimplification, but you know, like anything, it's got some truth in it that you know, sometimes you have to simplify these things in order to wrap the human brain around it.
Yeah, I like the line, myth is more true than the facts of the matter. Sometimes, you know, like the essence of the thing is more true than any way that we could have these brass tacks about it. So yeah, I've got a palette pretty well set up. It's giving me a lot of options. And so we can jump in and attack this. I don't know if it would be good to give a little break, or if I should just jump in.
I think that we already kind of gave people a little break. Perfect. And of course, people can always step away and come back at any point. But I think, yeah, people are probably raring to go.
Let's do it then. So basically, we've got so much warm going on in this painting that kind of what I'm going to have to do is lean towards the cool side. Like, we know that there's so much warm in the shadows that I don't really need to focus on making it warmer if I don't need to. Just like on this painting, all this cold, you know, the grays really translate to cold, and because we're mixing with white, which is our bright blue, everything is cooled down. So I'm going to have to lean into the cools on this side in order to sort of balance things. So in a way, you know, I'm kind of just going to assess local color and understand what color each element is going to be, more or less. And this is sort of a neutral composition. Nothing was really bright in this. There was it was basically a black backdrop, a silver kettle, so a lot of grays, even though it oxidized. Actually, I've got it over here, but there's all these blues and crazy greens and kind of strange colors popping out, not to mention whatever it's reflecting. Got a white mortar and pestle here, and like a little glass jar. Like, there's not a lot of really solid like color information where you'd say that's yellow or that's green or that's blue. It's all going to be in this neutral realm. So it's going to come down to anchoring into my chromatic black and my chromatic neutrals and kind of having fun with it and playing more with transparencies. So yeah, in a way, I'm going to just sort of try to jump into certain areas in the background, dealing with my darkest darks first, and trying to keep them sort of establishing how dark is dark and how transparent can that be. So fortunately, I've got all these transparent neutrals, so I know that I'm not going to have a solid, an opaque brush stroke in there. Everything, unless I mix it with white, is fully transparent, meaning worthy of being painted into a shadow. So I have a lot of shadow colors to work with, and only when I'm pulling into these lights am I going to sort of transition toward translucent, those midtones and highlights. So a couple ways we can deal with this with our oil, getting our medium in here, because we've got the paint, but it's going to be a bit dry to spread. Also, I've got a bit of surface tooth on this oil paper, so it's not going to spread very far. So two ways about it. One is I can either dip my brush or even a finger into my oil, if it's non-toxic, and paint that oil. This is called oiling out. And I'm selecting a certain shadow area at the moment that I know is going to be very dark behind the mortar and pestle. You can do this to your entire piece, but better to work on areas, just small areas at a time that you know you're going to paint. If you're working on a big composition, let's say that you know is going to take many days to complete and you're only going to work on one area at a time, best not to put oil over your entire painting. Then you're going to end up with unnecessary layers of just oil, and you're going to have issues later, as we were talking about fat over lean.
Right. So that kind of brings me back to that, problem I was describing, where, this is what I had done. And I do that often, oil it down the whole surface. And of course, in the Reinventing Painting chapter, I discuss that quite a bit. And in that one case, that resulted in there being a whole lot of oil and not very much paint.
Yeah.
And I guess, how do you know when not to do this?
Well,
because it is such a great way. I mean, once you've oiled it down, it just grabs the paint off your brush. It's great to work on.
Right. Not to mention it glows, and you can suddenly see the richness of your color. It shouldn't be dripping. Basically, I mean, the way people do it, often people will apply with their fingers very thinly, like exceedingly thinly, or you apply and then remove. We're not trying to have a solid layer of oil. We want it to just, like you said, just accept the paint off of the brush. So that would be removing it. One of the two, but it should definitely not be pooling, and it should definitely not be dripping down. But this way you can kind of really assess more cohesively how much oil is on the painting. I mean, I tend to be a painter that kind of dips into oil and dips into paint and goes with it. So it's not consistent. And because I'm using a thicker oil, it's less drippy, and it's a little easier to work with that way. But if you're using a really thin oil, it can be easy to have, you just dip into the oil and into your paint, apply it, looks great, and then suddenly you have oil dripping down. So this sort of mitigates that, and it allows us to just, see how much oil is on the surface and then not dipping back into the oil. If we're oiling out, I'm going to tend to just go right into my paint and right onto that surface.
I find it saves a ton of work. You're not fussing around with trying to get the perfect consistency with your paint, because it just becomes that as you're putting it on the piece.
Yeah, absolutely. So many different ways that it can work, really. I tend to like to have the ability to step into more oil and make a glaze thinner on demand. So I do often paint into, use a well of oil or a dish of oil, but there's kind of a difference between personal practice and best practices. And those, I don't know that I would teach people how I paint. It's more like there's a way to paint.
I sometimes talk about the tattoos where I actually follow all of my advice.
Yeah. Assuming you ever do. Yeah, it's great advice to take. Like, wow, that's a good idea. I should do that. So it's allowing me to put an extremely thin layer of paint on here where I can still see some of the detail that I had underneath in my underpainting. I'm kind of using a warm orangey neutral. I'm just super not worried about really what colors these things were. I'd have a really black, like kind of classical dead painting. I'm a little more interested in livelihood of the painting, the vibrance and the, you know, the experience of the colors. So I'm using a bit, you know, I'm using imaginal colors, let's say. I'm gonna just, they're neutral, but we'll pop into some brights once we move more into the midtones and highlights. I might use more of like a violet black that I had mixed up in order to see if I can push these shadows a little deeper. Because the underpainting in this case is so hot, the sienna, I can really afford to kind of push it into the cools, meaning more violets. This is a pretty cold red, the alizarin. And as we remember here, even if I know that I want my shadows to remain warmer and my highlights to remain cooler, even if the color that I'm putting down, I could even use this slate kind of blue. Even if I'm using a blue in those shadows, I would use a glazed blue, transparent with no white mixed in, and it will give me a feeling of more warmth in those shadows that I want. So, you know, it's sort of really a lot of room to just do what you feel, as long as you're keeping that value, temperature, and transparency map correct. Notice nowhere in there does it say use this color or that color exclusively in this way. Use whatever colors you want, particularly when these neutral mixtures are making everything play nicely together. But let's just make the values, the light and dark work, the temperature, the cool and warm, meaning glaze into the shadows and more opaque into the highlights. And where they meet in the middle will be translucent. And then the transparency, transparent shadows, translucent midtones, and opaque highlights. So it all kind of falls together. Those are my top three: value, temperature, transparency. And I'm like a broken record with it in class. You can assess so much of your painting with just those three things. And you sort of break it down. It's like, how's my shadow working? Are my shadows holding together? Are they the right transparency? Are they the right temperature as compared to the highlight? And we can kind of just assess. It's like a very scientific way. And of course, leave it to like colorblind people to overly logic the process for you. But
well, I mean, that's the same way that I've, you know, being a one-eyed dude, I've overly logicked the whole depth thing, you know, but somebody's got to make a system out of it, right?
That's it. I mean, I think that's, who else would really necessarily look at it in that way as much? You've had to make up for the depth perception, and your works are some of the most deep, you know, realistically, your paintings, some of those like light forms are just unbelievably deep, and it's because you understand the nature of the illusion that you're creating.
I can't take it for granted.
That's it.
Everyone else gets to live in a hologram. And because of that, I don't know if they ever think about it as much.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sometimes I'm jealous, but not really.
So I think the same kind of system of logic applies to any other thing that we might be doing, whether it's texture in a painting, whether it's so many different things like focus effects, and that would be for tattoos as well. Like, you know, there's you know, on one side, is it in focus or is it out of focus? Should it have texture? Should it not? And it meets in the middle. There's always a place where it kind of crosses over. So I think it's just a way to look at all these different parameters of making a piece of art. Where you sort of break it down into, does it need to be darker? Does it need to be lighter? You can kind of answer that question pretty simply if you just isolate the question. does it need to be brighter, more saturated, or does it need to be more neutral? Like we can kind of identify problem elements in our painting or challenging passages by just figuring out the right question to ask. Maybe a series of questions to ask ultimately.
Yeah, that's what is it next to? What are its immediately neighboring elements? Does it need to blend with them more or stand out more? Does it need to come forward or back?
Yeah, contrast or unification. So in a way, I'm kind of initially just starting with my shadows, pushing them as dark as they need to be, and I'm jumping around a bit. I've only oiled out in a certain area, and that area is much easier to paint into. And it's nice to just see the difference. It kind of just accepts the paint and immediately blends it. Whereas in areas where I haven't oiled out, like, oh, right, I actually would need to add some oil to that. So, you find a working method. I don't necessarily promote one way as the way. Everything, we find our personal flow with it.
And of course, sometimes the oiling out just happens as a result of adding a layer of paint and working it, and there comes a point where the surface has been oiled, but it's at that point you've got paint on the whole thing too. So
yeah,
the workability just always, it's continuously changing.
Yeah, I think the key thing to stay at this for this kind of painting is painting thinly first. Like when we're addressing our shadows, particularly, and painting with a bit of oil, whether or not we're oiling out, I'll oil out a little more and kind of paint this background, is painting thinly at first. If we get too much oil, you kind of have to get to a point where you have to either stop or remove a bunch of paint. Best to just sort of build up slowly. And that will allow us, in a way, to move all the way from shadows into midtones into highlights within a single passage of painting. Whereas if we get too oily, too goopy, then there's really not going to be much of a way to put highlights on top. It's sort of like, do you put peanut butter on top of jelly or the other way around? Like you need to put the more sort of stable layers first and build on top.
So yeah, when working with liquid and you're oiling down something, you have a much shorter window. And that was the first time I ever tried liquid. I didn't do anything else with it for years because I just thought it was so sticky. But that was back when I was doing much bigger paintings. And so I had this gigantic, by my standards, like a 3x5 foot canvas that I'm, trying to, basically run through the entire surface of it in one session. And by the end of it, it has just gotten so sticky. And I didn't like that. But, in retrospect, if I wanted to do that same painting, it would have been real easy to just say, okay, which parts do I want to work first? And, and not have to oil down the entire thing.
Yeah. I'm finding it really interesting. I'm kind of bringing some of these deep, inky, purpley blacks over transparently over the warm underpainting, and it sort of turns into colors that they're much harder to describe. I mean, if you took it into Photoshop, I'm sure it would, and you sampled a little pixel, I'm sure it would tell you, it would define what color it thinks that is. But ultimately, it's more of a whole spectrum within a little passage. I can see the color on top. I can see the color underneath. I can still perceive that light is passing through these, bouncing off the white surface and coming back to my eye. So there's a real, a sense of a little more depth and optical interest, a bit more of a spectacle than just a flat color. I think it attempts to mimic life in that way. So at first I might just be applying a very small amount of a transparent color, just a dark mixture, very, very thinly, and kind of smoothing it and spreading it. I might end up with a little bit of a white mixture in there, and granted, not fully opaque, but to be partially covering of the underpainting. We might find the underpainting in this brown sauce version where we kind of removed and didn't apply a lot of thick paint. It might look a little bit flat, a little two-dimensional. kind of like we still have our outline in there and it's just shaded a little bit. Adding a little bit of white into our mixture might help beef it up a little bit, make it feel just a little more substantial, which is kind of essential for a painting. We don't, in general, I mean, again, feel free to break all these rules and everything, but you want it to feel like it's really there, like it's solid. So there's kind of like too much, you can see, too opaque, not what we want, but easy enough. And then just remove a little bit.
Yeah, the thing I'm having fun with right now is just the color blending this, through this this glazing, because I'm doing flesh tones, and the underpainting was not too far off from flesh tone, although it was definitely more like umber,
Yeah.
and so now I'm bringing some more pinkish ochre colors in here, and it's a very subtle layering process, but even my colorblind self could kind of appreciate how you could get super specific with dialing in your colors, especially if you're willing to give yourself a few sessions.
Definitely. The subtlety really opens up, and I think that's what's interesting to me, that very quickly there's a range of color just based on the subtle value differences that we embedded in the underpainting. As soon as you glaze on top of that, the complexity just really grows into a place where if I had to mix it, it would look much more sort of plasticky compared to, just sort of fabricated compared to the level of complexity that can happen when simply glazing one color on top of a gradient, of a controlled gradient. Yeah, I find I need less colors to do the things that I thought I needed to do. It's so much
Well,
more.
when you think about a Pantone chart, right? You've got all these similar colors next to each other, and each one of them is going to be a different proportion of other colors mixed together. And in the course of doing a glaze across, another layer of color, and in that course of that glaze adding more or less of this other pigment, can so easily span such a large number of those Pantone numbers. You know what I mean? You just have instant access to all of it.
Yeah, and a bit of control with it, I think, too. Like, we're very much in control of our palette. There's a great deal of complexity that's emerged on my palette in terms of the color range, and yet it's come from 3 primary colors. So it's very easy to walk it back to that if we ever kind of lose our way and either forget what we were doing or run out of a color. It's very obvious to find it again. I think is empowering.
Another minor challenge I'm dealing with here is when we started this 2 weeks ago, I think it was pre-daylight savings.
Oh, the light's different.
And yeah, it's totally different. But I'm just trying to embrace that, because after all, I can change whatever I need to change.
Yeah, I mean, lighting is a tricky one, and as we all know, I mean, when the light changes from daylight to night, and you go from the cold reflected light of the daytime to the usually warm inner light, unless you bought 5000K bulbs or whatever they are to kind of mimic that. That's some real mind trick. I usually have to stop painting for a few hours at dusk just to give my eyes a break from, you see your painting in one way all day, and then suddenly it changes on you. Someone will come in and turn on a light in your studio because it's finally, the light's waning outside, and you just have to stop. It's like, now I don't even know what I'm looking at.
Yeah. And I think for me, part of my whole shtick through all this has been to just not worry about accurately representing things. And I don't know if that's just a cop out. You know what I mean? I'm figuring as long as it's got enough contrast, enough visual impact, but, I'm doing things that are mostly abstract. And so no one's going to look at it and say, hey, that's not a realistic color combination there.
Right. But at the same time, I think you've got what we understand from that, or what I glean from that, is that you have the principles of art in place. I mean, a biomech or reality or something that might be somewhat abstract, but the rules of light and shadow and of temperature are being obeyed so that we will accept it as real. We accept the dimensionality and the physicality of something, even if it's out of your mind. So I don't know. I think that's where art gets interesting. It's amazing to represent something as it looks to our eye. That's fantastic, and was maybe a little more important prior to photography, just in terms of its impact on the world. And now it's like, what is it? What does our inner world look like? I think that's interesting. What does a fantastic color scheme look like? Something you would never see in reality. May have a little more meaning, or holds more meaning for me anyway. I love seeing fantastic color combinations that I would not be able to just see on a day-to-day basis in the world. That's what impresses me about painting. The logic, the way that painters can make something that you see as real, you can understand it, and yet maybe it's more real than real because of how they've used the color, or used their brushwork, or decided to express themselves.
And then you've got the other whole question about the universal versus the personal when it comes to art. And of course, we want people to relate to our art, but we don't want to make it so universal. I mean, most of us anyway, that it doesn't say anything about ourselves. Like, even if you're painting a landscape, you're going to be choosing the aspects of that jump out to you, and you're going to be filtering them and representing them in a way that makes you feel. So, when you're doing art that's just straight from a photograph with no interpretation at all, on some levels it might seem like a much more honest kind of painting, but it's kind of like removing your whole self from the process.
Yeah, like how to engage the other and engage yourself at the same time. It's correct.
Well, and I don't know if this is everyone's experience, but when I'm trying to sell paintings, which is mostly my tattoo clients, but they're a lot more likely to buy a piece from me that is not just a straight up copy of a photo. Like, I've done a lot of just studies, like, oh, this is a cool object, I'm just going to paint this. And people are much more interested in seeing something that I have twisted my own way a little bit, at least for their own collections.
Definitely. Yeah, the soul of the artist gets to play here. Absolutely. And I think it does anyway, even in a photographic piece, certainly, but maybe less so. It's less obvious. Certainly, it's like that way. If you're painting a portrait, it's always somehow looks a little bit like the painter. It's just sort of like the hybrid of the person being painted and the painter. I find that really
hard to avoid.
Yeah, it is.
Maddeningly hard to avoid.
Right? Even if you don't spend a lot of time looking in the mirror, it's like that signature of who you are and how you see the world comes through. But how cool, like. Yeah,
I mean, what you're feeling at the time, the way that it might translate into your own face is going to end up in that face. It's hard to avoid.
So just to narrate a little bit, I'm painting super thinly. I'll pull this up for a little closer examination. I'm keeping the shadows really thin to where a lot of it, you're still kind of seeing the heat of the background. And part of that is because I know that we've been talking about, again, white as the brightest blue. So I know that I'm going to use white as my basically highlight and light source. And because there's so much warm in this piece, it really already fills the space of those warm shadows, the warm transparent shadows. So I'm, in a way, adding to the shadows. I'm adding some cools, adding some sort of purpley blacks to them, but they're still very warm. They're still very luminous is the key. And it immediately is creating a deeper three-dimensionality to the piece. And you can see that the midtones and highlights have not been dealt with. They're still really thin. Like, you know, in this case, this is just like, obviously hasn't been treated yet compared to the shadows, but you kind of get these, you know, these, trying to find this without glare here, you get these sort of inky deep shadows where you can't really grasp it. It just sort of disappears from you. And that's what I'm looking for. That's what I really like in a shadow, is it vaporizes. It turns into kind of nothingness. So a little bit of glazing on top of my underpainting, and I'm quickly achieving the depth of shadows that I want. I've got a lot of control, and I can kind of, when there's enough oil on the surface, I can build into it and keep adding more pigment until I get the right value. Just sort of pushing the background back, not only through darkness, but through transparency. And that illusion immediately presents itself as convincing, more convincing. Like you can just reach into the shadows and just, your hand would just disappear into it. So
yeah, detailed shadows, they're just contradictory.
Yeah, absolutely. And gosh, the classical, that's why I love, you know, work like playing in multiple different artistic paradigms, because different art scenes have a different way of speaking to this stuff. And love the classical approach, like the classical atelier world with it, because they're very clear that you put like zero detail in the shadows, like anything, you know, beyond the core shadow. You sort of have your light hitting, and then there's a core shadow and it flips into the reflected light. Everything in the reflected light, at least at first in a drawing, is just treated as one flat value. The classical drawings that show that, even if they're just a sketch that's partway through the drawing, I find it so charming. I mean, every piece of the shadow of a, say it's like a figure or a portrait, is exactly the same value. It's just like the shadows hold together so structurally. It just shows a lot of restraint and sort of mastery in that technical approach. I like those better than like the finished drawings in a way where it's fully rendered. Eventually, yeah, a little bit of form comes out of it, a little bit of shading. But at first, like, just so impressive.
Lots of discipline there.
It really is. It really is. I got to spend.
And, you know, if you like rendering, it's sometimes hard to know where to stop.
What's interesting about impact, right? Like, I mean, that's kind of the idea of subverting detail in the shadows. Yeah, if you, for instance, if I'm looking at an object, because we have to train ourselves. A photograph doesn't do it, and our eye tricks us. If I'm looking at an object, I tend to look all around that object. My pupil is dilating and changing its level of light that it lets in based on where I'm looking at the object. If I'm looking into the shadow area of, say, of my composition, and I'm suddenly looking for detail in these folds of the fabric, my pupil's gonna open up, and I'm gonna see more detail, and then I might paint it as though I were seeing, as though that's how a painting should look. But you're kind of like tricking yourself, and you end up putting full detail in every aspect of a painting. Nothing wrong with that. Just want to say, if we do that, I do that sometimes, but if we're wanting to make something look really naturalistically real, the way to address, say, these shadows I'm painting in the background would be for me to look at the part of my still life that I'm actually being drawn to, which would be a highlight, like either the bright highlight on the kettle, a few different places there, wherever the most detail is that I'm being drawn into, would be look at my still life at that place, and while looking at that, notice what's happening in the shadows without changing my focus to it. And that might tell me, oh, I don't need to paint this nearly in that much detail. Maybe I'm not even noticing much information there when I'm actually assessing the part of the picture that I'm trying to draw the viewer into. So that's sort of just like a trick if you're working from life or even from a photo perhaps. And that might trickle down into focus effects, subversion of detail, unifying the shadows. Might see areas.
Sounds like a lot of that is just taking stock of what your senses are telling you, making sure you're not making any assumptions.
Yeah, it really is. And, there's no one way to do it. Like there's plenty of paintings and plenty of painters that, go everything in the full light of detail. No judgments here. But it's just looking at, I guess, how we can play with these polarities. I'm always interested in that. Polarities and what unifies them. Some metaphors in there for me. I like paradox a lot. And it's sort of like what unifies these opposites? What unifies light and shadow? And is shadow be fully expressing itself as shadowness if I'm putting too much light in it? Is the detail part of my painting allowed to be as rich as it wants to be, as crisp as it could be, if I'm also putting detail somewhere else that's competing with it? It's just like this whole.
I remember the first time I got to collaborate with Philip Liu. He was showing me how sometimes he would detail out an area that's going to be meant to be in shadow, and then after that he would then take just a big mag and just generally plow over everything, not shade in between stuff, but just like taking spray paint across it. And man, it made so much sense. Of course you have to be careful about not chewing people up, but he knows all those thresholds by heart. And I especially if you're doing it across multiple sessions, sometimes I love doing that, is getting a piece, all the detail in there, and then coming back in a later session and going over parts of those detail with shadows, with 60% value or something, just over everything. And it ends up just really selectively popping certain things.
That is exactly the nature of glazing. That's exactly what we're talking about. And you kind of have, I feel like, two entry points, or you could approach it in opposite ways. One would be put the detail first and then subvert it. And that's sort of what we're doing with underpainting and overpainting. Or you could, really have a dialed palette and kind of just get a little bit of that detail in with a very unified spectrum of color. But I love that. It makes all kinds of sense to me to sort of put it there and then undo it. Like it'd be great for landscape painting, drop in trees on these distant horizons and then put the fog over it. That's what nature's doing. We can mimic that. I think if you can find it in nature, it's kind of a legitimate technique for making art. You can find a way that those effects are coming to life, then you can mimic that and have it really work. Yeah, I guess I'm not probably going to do this whole thing because we want to actually work through it a little bit, and work into the next stages. But what we can see is that I've really addressed the shadows and how those shadows are starting to emerge into the halftones.
Yeah, it's really striking how much depth you've got just from this early stage.
So yeah, I mean, you could, like we were seeing in some of the pieces in part one, the underpainting was like, it was enough. They didn't really need to move into color that much, or into the highlights that much. Granted, if you do only this move, you kind of end up with really inky, dark compositions, which might be the style that we're aiming for. But I kind of want to find a few areas in here that I can take to a greater level of finish, just so we can see how we might step into that.
Yeah, or just to lift some things out more beyond just those few bright highlights.
Exactly. And it's even okay if I've gone over, if I go over some of those highlights with this glaze, if it helps to unify things. Like even though this is a lighter area on the kettle, I might just still partly to get some oil on it, and partly to unify things further. Just even glaze on top of that minimally. So it's fine, even if it sort of dampens the things that are going to get brighter, because I'm going to pop them out with more opaque color that will be mixed with white, mixed with our titanium, kind of a beast of opaque white. I mean, one thing when thinking about older painting techniques and, you know, sort of a classical look, you know, they were not using titanium white. It was all lead white in the Renaissance. And that, if anyone's ever used lead white, it's just so delicate and sensitive compared to titanium white.
So basically, you had a much harder time building up highlights with it.
In a way, yes. Compared to what we're used to, they certainly managed to do it. But they had a much easier time transitioning from shadows into midtones, into highlights. Like titanium, it's kind of a beast. It's like, I find the opaque lights are easy, but we tend to be less subtle when it comes to midtones and to these sort of very sensitive transitions. You're kind of like full blown, you know, blasted with light. So it's just a different way, but sort of in response, colors have had to get brighter because of the titanium is just such a powerhouse that it will quickly take a color that was really dark. I have these piles of really dark color, and so quickly they turn to a pastel. It's very tough to find that like range where some of the personality is drawn out of the color without completely obliterating it.
And so how would you compare that to zinc white, that's what I'm using here?
Zinc is kind of between lead and titanium. Zinc is definitely more sensitive and more subtle, certainly. It sort of approximates lead white more so. So I haven't really addressed much in terms of actual color. I'm just dealing with shadow, and that's sort of just the way my mind works. I'm so much less interested in color and much more interested in temperature and effects. That's just where I'm at with things. So oil out a little more to start to find a place where it can build into a little bit of more light.
So here's a question for you, David. What would you rather do with the rest of our session today? Would you rather stay focused on this one panel and maybe consider a part 3 sometime? Or do you think we should leave these unfinished and move to the next one so that we can continue layering? Or what do you think is best way to make the most of this?
Pretty open. If it was part 3, it might, let's see, we just have to figure out the schedule. Pretty wide open though.
Yeah, I mean, that doesn't have to happen at any particular time as long as it's relatively near future. But
I think we could do part 3 in a way, because I think, you know, we're already at 2.5 hours. I think, you know, just a little more time on this and we could be at a pretty full session without introducing another degree of complexity easily.
Yeah, I'm looking at this other one and I'm thinking, wow, that's like another whole journey. And
yeah, that's great. You're not twisting my arm too much to get me to come hang out and paint.
Right on. Yeah, I'm actually really excited about our Monday night exercises this coming month. You remember Kurt Windish, who joined us the other night? He was the guy painting that very heavily textured composition.
Incredible.
But Kurt is great with light. He does a lot of nice light form kind of things, but he's definitely found his own twist on it. But his understanding of light is really strong. So he's going to be joining us for a month of lighting exercises. I don't know if he's going to be able to make it to all of them, but yeah, we're going to go through, you know, ambient light, hard directional light, backlight, you know, multiple light sources, you know, on camera versus on camera light sources, all that stuff. Awesome. Really excited about it.
I'll have to join in for some of that. Sounds good. So I'm just mixing up. I basically mixed up a little bit of a gray with my chromatic black and white, and I'm just going to kind of ease into it.
Beautiful photo. Red cardinal and the yellow for Cynthia. Grab your camera and get a picture. No? It's beautiful. Okay.
There's this
Yeah,
funny
one thing I
thing.
haven't done. Oh, go ahead.
You go for it. I'll jump in after.
Oh yeah, I was just saying one thing I haven't done yet is really gone into any of my cool underlighting, and I'm watching the lighting in the room change because now it is getting to that point where the light coming through the window is getting, you know, softer. And I'm wondering how much of that I want. Do I want it to return to how it was last week or 2 weeks ago? And we recently did an exercise that was about, you know, using cool underlighting, but really trying to ramp it back into something that didn't look cartoonish.
Yeah.
And it was really interesting. And you know, the best of those, the best looking examples that people turned in were very, very, you know, disciplined uses of warm and cool.
Yeah. I understand that. I get that with like atmospheric perspective. I look at the mountain ranges and my brain fills in this intensely bright blue and in the very distant mountain ranges. I see how it's cooling as the light goes back, and my tendency is to want to paint it really bright. And in reality, like the more convincing, you know, illusion of it, they're more like gray than blue. And it's just really.
It just depends on if you want to stylize, you know.
Yeah.
There's a couple artists I follow that do very exaggerated color schemes in their landscapes. William Hawkins, he's one of them. I really like his landscapes are extremely chunky, you know, like everything's done with like a 1-inch brush, and the colors are very exaggerated, but because it's exaggerated consistently throughout, it kind of works, you know.
Get away with it. Yeah. So I'm sort of working up. There's this question about how do you paint, like, say you have a still life full of white objects on a white table in a white room lit with a white light, and yet it's like none of that is white. You know, there's so much information in that, and you know, I find the painters who can achieve those kinds of things, you know, you've got a real control of temperature.
So do they ever do that to you in art school, is actually set up something like that and make you work your way through it?
No, I never went to an art school where we were doing anything like that, so I've never done it, but I can imagine torturing my students with something like that fully. But what a great exercise in a way to have to see how much information light brings you, regardless of the local color of a thing. I guess that's what we're trying to get at a little bit with this. Here I'm starting to build a little bit of depth into the mortar and pestle there, and I've mixed a gray that I'm pulling out of the. Let's see if I don't glare.
Yeah, I can see a little bit more color range in there too.
And it's just my chromatic black mixed with a little white, which we know is not like sort of a dead black at all, but the optical nature of it happening, you know, right where it's not the highlight, because the highlight I'm going more opaque white and gray. We know the shadow is sort of this brown sauce, but it's in the middle. I find this to be the most interesting part of the painting, where your highlights transition into your halftones and the halftones transition into the shadows, and we can get what ultimately reads to the eye as opalescence, because we're floating a semi-opaque light on top of a transparent background. And it's where the two meet that some effects happen that would not ever be able to happen if you were just fully mixing your color and placing it. There's just no way to mimic that with opaque color. And I'm sure it doesn't translate through the camera, and you know, it's kind of like a thing to play with. You can do it even just in color swatches, like we were just doing these color samples. You could do the same thing, a very similar thing, if you just toned your background of your paper. Now I've got one here. You could just start with a toned ground to begin, like just run some brown paint, let it dry, and then come across it with these color swatches. But instead of just using the glaze, instead of just mixing opaque white into the color, maybe you mix the white into the color and then pull that off more transparently, and see what kind of amazing sort of optical dance it does. And I think
You know,
that's one of the,
not to keep, oh, go ahead.
no, you go for it.
Yeah, not to keep, you know, making these tattooing comparisons, but you know, the difference between doing all your color in one session, or, you know, doing a pass over the whole thing. Now, some people will just do some colors in one session and some in another. I like to try to get a pass over the whole thing, a thin layer of color. And then when you apply more color, you're doing mixing right there in the skin, because you've got different ways to mix. You can mix in the skin, you can mix on your palette, and you can mix on the brush. You know, if you want, you can mix, you know, tubes. And just like with tattooing, you can mix whole bottles of custom pigment, or you can mix it there in your cap, or you can mix it in the skin as you layer it. Each is a different way, and gives you a different way of controlling the way that the colors mix.
Exactly. I love the tattoo analogies. I mean, I think that's the point and the beauty of some of this, is seeing how these mediums cross over. And you know, I'm looking for that as I'm returning to tattoo. I'm looking how can I bring painting back into that, and a lot of people are looking the opposite direction. How can I bring what I already know to work in one medium and make it work for me in another?
Right, and you know, coming from being very experienced with skin and wanting to pick up an understanding of paint, it's good that those analogies can kind of work in both directions.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, in a way, this imprimatura, that first layer of color we gave to this underpainting, it's like establishing a skin tone. We're going, okay, here's the baseline. Building up from there. Granted, you know, we have the ability to put fully opaque paint on top of it in really thick layers. So the parameters are different, but the rules of light don't change. The rules of, you know, making a great drawing haven't changed. Applying it through a different medium. As complex as sometimes like layered painting seems, and you know, I'm not going fully into the like paint chemistry that I might in a longer course, and this is trying to make it a bit more palatable and tangible quickly. But I think that even though we're painting in layers, and sometimes that seems more confusing or longer process, I think it also, by dividing the labor into the drawing phase and into the sort of glazing and overpainting phase, it is making it, I don't know, a bit more bite-sized, a bit more palatable, and to be able to get a result quickly that has a lot of depth in it without having to work that hard for it.
No, I mean, it's just like tattooing itself is also, you know, especially when you're approaching it more traditionally, very much divided into these sort of distinct bite-sized processes. You're outlining, and then you're applying your shading and your color, and you know, of course, those of us who are a little more painterly or intuitive with it might kind of mix and match those processes as we see fit. And of course, I try to encourage reinventing, you know, readers to you know, go as far down that rabbit hole as they want, because I think those old restrictions, you know, have their time and place. But once you get past your basics, you really want to find that freedom.
Yeah, good to understand the why of that. Like what was the purpose for that to happen? And then we don't have to always like learn the rules, break the rules, but at least know them and know what they were. Dali said that too. I keep coming back to him, but that basically learn to paint like the old masters, then everyone will, you can do whatever you want because everyone will respect you. You will have known those, you will have understood the parameters. Yeah, no different with tattooing. It's like kind of understand what makes a striking image, and in its most simple terms, and then you can suddenly see how those rules may or may not need to apply to you.
Just wanted to hop in. We've got a comment from on YouTube, which I didn't check for a little while, so I'm sorry, Jason, but it took a little bit. Jason Blanton is saying this is great to have a glimpse behind the curtain, and he's wondering about flake white, if you have anything to say about that pigment.
Well, flake white is another way of speaking about lead white. And hi, Jason. Nice to hear you, buddy. Long time. Tattoo artist, inspirational friend of mine from forever ago, Seattle days. Flake white is another kind of lead white, and this will show my pigment geekery and the level to which I am into this stuff. But basically, lead white is made through a certain alchemical process. I think I described it a little bit last time, where carbon dioxide and vinegar vapors are acting on lead sheets. In the modern day, lead white is made and it's finely divided, and all the particle sizes are exactly the same, like made in a modern factory. Whereas flake white is basically made in more that way I was describing, and sometimes it would be in a shed full of the horse manure, and the vapors from the manure are the thing that's corroding the lead. And we can do that with vinegar and a beer in a closed container, let's say a fermentation. And what happens is that lead corrodes, and you get this thick pillow of lead. I believe it's lead acetate before you wash it, and it becomes lead carbonate. But it flakes off of the lead sheet, and when you grind it, and then ultimately look at it under the microscope, all the pigment particle sizes are very different, are extremely varied. And if you think about how that affects a layer of paint film, and if you have all perfectly finely divided pigments, they'll stack like spheres, as very tightly packed, and you might end up with a very flat paint layer from that. Whereas if you have this very different aggregate, it bulks up a lot more. And so I think you could see a lot more impasto in painting using flake white, and perhaps even the pigment would, even though it's lead and therefore very transparent, you could get a lot more seemingly opaque optics out of it, because it's really a different character altogether. I have some flake white here somewhere. It's very expensive to buy, as opposed to just, you could probably make a ton of it if you had a month or two and some horses laying around,
Yeah.
So that's one of the goals for next year out on the land, is definitely get into that. Yeah, it's so many terms for lead white, actually. You hear it called Kremnitz white, Kremser white, flake white, lead white, silver white. All those are lead white. But there's like historical precedent for a lot of why they're called what they're called. It kind of comes down to us in these ways where we think the names are arbitrary, but they actually came from these sort of very specific historical moments. Really appreciate that. It's like etymology of our words, really understanding the root, why a word means what it means. There's a lot of that with paint. It's gotten confusing in paint tubes. You go to the store and you buy something called amethyst. It's not made of amethyst. It's a mixed color that reminds one of amethyst, but at the same time, you see chromium oxide green. That is made from those elements of chromium and oxidized chromium. You see emerald green. Clearly, it's not made of emeralds. So we're kind of in this hybrid dimension regarding our materials.
Okay, so specifically, when does it say hue? When it's just mimicking what it says that it is?
Yeah, that's it. Hue is not what it. Hue is when it's basically like faux. You could use hue for faux. Like this is like what cerule or cobalt blue hue is one, probably. I'm trying to think of of a term of one of the names. Like cobalt hue is probably going to be ultramarine mixed with a touch of white to get it to seem similar to that. At this point, I avoid any tube, just from me personally, I avoid hue because what I assume is they're telling me is you could just as easily mix this color yourself. And we're probably charging you more than we would charge you for either of those other colors because we mixed it for you. So, I mean, I've had all of the tubes of paint. For sure, I collected so much paint, but at this point, if it says hue, unless it's like somehow just absolutely valuable and unmixable to me, I will avoid it because generally they're just charging you more for something that you could mix yourself. So one thing I want to just mention, there's sort of a hybrid technique, right? We're oiling out and painting the shadows really thin. Then as I'm moving into to my highlights and my volumes, let's say, like suddenly this, this porcelain is like really popping out of the background, painting it with some kind of opaque gray and then more and more into white. And I'm going to keep pushing the white, see how bright I can get it, painting it more solid all the time. On the edges, I'm wiping off what you're not seeing off screen. I'm wiping off my brush on a paper towel, coming back in with a very dry brush and feathering the edges so that I don't have a solid edge where my opaque color meets the transparent color. I want to sort of feather them, and I'm often brushing in sort of an opposite direction as the angle of, this round dish kind of rounds elliptically that way. I might come across it and sort of cut across that edge where the light meets the shadow and see how.
So Nick Baxter, you know Nick, right? Who was with us the other night. He in his book he used the term turning the edges. Have you heard that term before?
I've heard turning form. Yeah, turning form is definitely a familiar one.
But yeah, the idea being that you want to keep that edge from being so unnaturally sharp that it kills some of the illusion in the piece.
Exactly. It's just really walking that light all the way back. And we tend to stop too soon. We tend to go, there's the highlight, there's the shadow, but there's this whole dimension of interpermeation where it's not one and not the other. So I've just kind of see how far I can get that little film of light to come across into the shadows. It's sort of an endless dance in a way. It can really be the difference between a piece that stings or that is just nuts and bolts. I mean, it's kind of easy anyone can draw a couple of eyes and a shape for a nose and a line for the lips, but to make a portrait, for instance, really convincing, that's a whole other order of magnitude. And one of my teachers in the master's degree in geometry was saying, the difference between 99% accuracy in a geometric drawing and 99.9% accuracy in that same drawing, it's a whole order of magnitude. And then what about 99.99%? It pretty much looks the same, but there's this increasing precision. And I think to a degree, it's what we want to bring into painting, this increasing level of subtlety of our subject, of merging with it, completely falling into our subject matter and just like giving your whole attention to it.
Damon in the comments is saying that, wow, David is a serious wizard of pigments. You're busting out the horse manure shed. And he's also saying that he's appreciating all the tattoo analogies as well. There, Guy.
Great. Yeah. Well, we'll keep doing that. And I mean, I think I would have asked David to do this even if he weren't coming back into tattooing. But I think it's kind of fun that there is that factor in here, and so there's an extra degree of awareness, I think, in terms of how do these things translate across the two mediums. And in reinventing, I try to tell people you should paint because it's going to make you a better tattooer. I mean, it's nice to be a good painter too, but we're all trying to become better at our primary career here. And, if we can become good painters, for painting's sake in the process, that's all well and good. But the way that they translate across is, you're able to reinforce these things in your brain a lot better if you're using them in both platforms.
Couldn't agree more with you there, definitely. Yeah, we'll keep the the horse manure coming, no problem. It's so interesting. Like, how did people figure this stuff out? So much of life was probably a big accident at one point. You're like, wow, look at that.
Well, I was thinking about like, glow in the dark stuff, phosphorus, like back in the olden days, in order to distill that, they got it from urine, but they had to really cook it down. Who figured that out?
Yeah,
they're going to take a bunch of pee, and I'm going to put it in a cooking pot and tend over it for a few days. It's like, you gotta have a good reason to do something like that. It's not going to happen by accident.
Yeah, the alchemists were pretty into that already. So who knows what they were searching for?
Yeah, and who knows how much stuff they stumbled upon while trying to turn lead into gold.
Exactly. Quite a bit of it. It's actually been the name, the tattoo moniker that I've chosen is the means turning lead into gold. Chrysopoeia is the process by which we turn lead into gold, and I think that's exactly what we do with pigments, whether it's a tattoo or whether it's a painting. We're taking base materials, reorganizing them in a way that they have a coherence and suddenly have more value, whether it's to the wearer of the tattoo or to the beholder of the painting. That's an apt metaphor, I think.
So all artists are alchemists in their own way.
Definitely. And it's interesting, or I would say we're alchemist assistants. I had a fun revelation around this. Nature is the true alchemist, right? We're kind of like lucky enough to watch. Like, you watch your tattoo heal and you go, who actually healed that? I didn't do it. I just watched it happen, and every time it happens, it's a miracle. Amazing. I mean, I put some salve on it and that was cool. But there's this, like, we're engaging with nature, and that's definitely what we're doing by observing light, as we're talking about these principles of painting and trying to mimic reality in the way that we see it and to see it deeper. But it recently hit me, there's this term, like, an alchemist never hires their apprentice or assistant for more than 24 hours at a time. It's like, why is that? What is that about? And it's like, oh, right, it keeps you really focused on the stage of the process you're in. You're not thinking about what we're going to do tomorrow or how this is going to finish. You just really give your whole self the process that you're working on at the moment. And kind of like, cool, yeah, okay, so if I'm working, don't hire my assistant for more than 24 hours. And then I went, I am the assistant, actually. Nature is the alchemist, and what it's asking of me is to be completely absorbed in the process that I'm in, as opposed to thinking that I am the alchemist that can space out and do whatever I want. I don't know, it's just an interesting a humbling revelation regarding whether it's, development of your own spiritual path or your painting or anything you're working on, is like, be present with what you're doing, and then you will get hired for tomorrow. But if you're kind of like not there for today, you're not going to be there for tomorrow either. So I don't know, it hit me recently in an interesting way that, well, it sucked the ego out of any idea I had about being the alchemist. It was more like, you are the assistant. Don't forget, you're the apprentice to nature. That was cool. Like, take the pressure off in a way. It's great.
Yeah,
I can do that. Super fun.
there is a collaboration going on there. Easy to forget.
Definitely. A little note on brushwork. As I'm kind of applying the as I'm applying let's say the halftones, the intermediate tones, I'm a little more brushy. I'm like trying to get them to blend into the shadows. And then as I'm moving toward the highlights, I'm kind of like dabbing the paint on a little more. You'll notice this if have painted with oils very much. You put a dab of titanium white on and you think you're going to spread it and it's still going to be bright. And the moment you spread it, it becomes like just mixed with whatever else is around it. Like the moment you move it. So it's kind of like I'm dabbing it on a little more, and then I might get to the point, I'll do a little highlight where I might even use a palette knife just for kicks to go like the ultimate level of it. I might just even put one final stroke on with the palette knife and leave it. And like suddenly, I thought I had it white there before, and suddenly look how freaking bright that highlight got.
Oh, wow. Yeah, crazy.
And I'm not gonna touch that. Well, I probably will because I'm neurotic about blending edges, but I should try to leave that. You know, there's some personality, there's some unpredictability within that. It's impasto, so it's even going to catch some light. And I may try to do that a little bit on this upper rim of the porcelain there, just to try to get a little bit of that glinting light in there. And I don't mind if it's a little loose and messed up a little there, but I'll come fix that. But just to really see how far the white can go, it really shows me how, how neutralized it gets, particularly when I've got all this oil on the painting already. Blend that out. If you mess up a spot, I got white down here in an area I didn't want it. Honestly, I'm just taking a dry brush. The solution to most things I find in an oil painting where I've kind of like messed something up is a dry brush. You can pull paint off, you can blend paint in, I can soften edges, and I'm just endlessly drying the brush. So kind of just dabbing around that super bright highlight to try to use it in a little bit more, segue it out. So I'll keep painting on other areas, but I guess everything that I really want to do is kind of contained within this idea of this, the porcelain dish here is like, I'm establishing my shadows first. Shadows and the dark halftones. Coming back in with whatever my local color is, and if it's a brighter color, it can absolutely be, this is a white dish, so I kind of used a gray for that, which was mixed with my chromatic black and white. Basically treating that as my local color. It's more opaque for sure, and I'm painting into the wet, blending that towards my dark halftone, which is giving basically a whole series of optical gray mixtures in here, and just really kind of establishing all that first, and just building closer and closer to the highlights the whole time. So that's that's the process that I'm going to apply to all these other foreground objects, and to a lesser degree, the background objects, where I've already got the shadows going in. So that's really it. Kind of like establish our shadows first, bring our halftones in, and then build toward the highlights. And like I said, if the highlights get, too mixed into the shadows, if they don't get bright enough, wait for the painting to dry and come back and apply them next time. So it's really forgiving, many, many layers that make light work in a sense.
Yeah, I'm starting to wonder if I'm not at a point where this should dry before I do too much more.
Yeah.
Because now I'm trying to lift things up that before I had lifted by, with a rag. And so I'm getting different temperature, different character in these highlights.
Right.
I'm trying to adjust the shape of the thumb a little bit. I'm getting to that point where I'm starting to get fussy about anatomy, where before I wasn't really that worried about it.
Yeah, there's really like it kind of painting in layers, when you see this division, it kind of tells you when you need to stop as well. Like, oh, there was a purity you might have had in that first layer that then sort of gets lost sometimes.
And I like where I'm at, but I don't feel finished. And I definitely feel like I need to glaze it to get it there, because I don't want to lose any of it at this point. I've kind of painted the whole thing. I knocked down the background, temperature wise, quite a bit. There's just a little bit of that ochre umber kind of color coming through the brown sauce. I let a lot more of that color come through the hand. I tried to add pink to the hand, but I think I'm going to need to let it dry and do that again. Mm-hmm. I tried to add the blue backlighting a little bit, and I don't know, maybe I could hit that just a tiny bit more, but yeah, I'm kind of coming to the point where I'm going to do more harm than good.
Yeah,
if I'm not careful.
You're totally right that like a glaze, like at this point, to let it dry, and a subtle glaze would do things that opaque paint is not going to be able to do at this stage.
I'm one of these stubborn, I'm going to just try to do it a la prima kind of people, but I'm trying not to be. And almost every painting I do, I end up having to go back into anyway. So there's just a part of me that wants to try to do it all at once. It's like getting into the car and say, I'm going to drive to Texas all at once, and then getting most of the way there and say, if I don't get a hotel, I'm going to kill myself.
Yeah. Well, there's a great line. I can't remember who it's from, but it's like, always endeavor to finish your painting in one session, basically, because you'll never do it. But next time, the next session will be much easier. You'll get a lot more done later.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Don't worry about it. It won't happen. I mean, some people are fantastic and it will, but that's not how I paint at all. And I had a line for a while that was like, I'm always treating a painting like it's my second to last session. Like, what if I could get it most of the way there without the pressure of completion? And then you come back next session and treat it the same way. You're like, well, let me see if I can get it like right to the edge. And not to say never completing a painting, but I feel like it helps you push a painting farther than you might otherwise. Like, well, I could get it pretty far, but I don't have to have that moment of feeling like, am I really done or not? You just, I don't know, there was something about the cutting edge of that line of thinking that sort of worked for me. Everyone's got their own way, though. Part of it was just the pressure of finishing a painting, because if you're like, I'm going to finish this today, and then if you don't, you're like, well, you're kind of disappointed. Well, I didn't finish it. Why didn't I finish it? What if I just get it close? And it sort of made it easier. And then maybe you'd even get it to a point where it's beyond where you thought you would have taken it, because you just keep treating it like it's the second to last day. Suddenly you're like, wow, I would have just quit already. I would have just called it done, but you kind of keep that tension there. I don't know. Weird.
Yeah, I mean, we do make better paintings that way, I think, because I mean, it's just like with a tattoo session. I realize, all right, I'm only going to have one more visit on this sleeve. And so if I give it that extra half hour right now, even though I'm tired, I'll be able to do a second layer on these, on these yellows, for example. And I know it's going to settle better across the years. And so, trying to set myself up so that last session can be decisive and conclusive. And, of course, with a tattoo, you're going to have a lot less say into how many sessions that might be. They're going to have their own ideas. They want to move on to their next piece.
You said it.
And plus, I feel a little self-conscious after somebody has, paid a certain amount for a tattoo. I know it's time to move on to the next one.
You're right. Set yourself up. That's what all this is. Like, have a good drawing to set yourself up for a good underpainting. Have a great underpainting to set yourself up for a good overpainting. Couldn't say it better, really.
So, David, I'm going to have to step away and perform a veterinary procedure. I've been putting it off. I think that I'm about as far as I'm going to get. I don't know if you want to invite anyone who's watching to hop on the Zoom and take a quick look at their pieces, or if you and Sandy need to get going. But yeah, if you've still got time, that could be fun.
Yeah.
And
take some time and
But,
chat with people. Sure.
Any comments on this thing?
Well, first of all, I love that. I love the shadow you have from your indoor lighting. That's super fun.
I love crossover shadows when they, you know, multiply on top of each other like that.
Great. Yeah. Yeah. The you know, the reflected light is really singing right now. It's subtle, but it's really singing in comparison to your opaque lights.
It might be too blue, but I don't want to mess with it right now. I think I'm gonna go back to it.
Exactly. I mean, the only thing in terms of what we're playing with here, I would say the only thing, and you're right, it's let it dry and come back, is even on the thumb, the area where the reflected lights are, I would say you have room to do a super thin glaze just to establish more transparency in the shadows. We know that it's reflected light, but that also visually that area belongs to the shadows.
It'll unify better after it's glazed. But yeah, look in real life. Look at my actual hand. How much blue is hitting it?
Totally. Yeah.
So,
exactly.
yeah, I had to ramp back on it a little bit because it didn't even look natural. So I might mess with that for another minute or two. But yeah, it's I feel sometimes that sometimes being real. I mean, like you were saying, sometimes you know, people feel inclined to go too blue with their distant mountain ranges or whatever. But sometimes it's the opposite that's happening. You have to look at the reality and say, whoa, that's almost too much.
Yeah.
It's almost not plausible. Or to the people that look at it, it's going to stretch their credibility.
Yeah, it so comes down to our personal language with art, which is we're so fortunate at this time. I mean, if we were living 400 years ago, you could not get away with this stuff. And it's kind of like just up to us to develop our signature that way. I think that's really the exciting part about it. There's no right way, and anything goes at this point.
Yeah.
So the fact that even like no effort whatsoever goes. So the fact that we're putting so much, you know, specifically tattoo artists and like realist painters and people who are pushing themselves that way are putting so much energy in I think our little stylistic flares that we get to put in there are really enjoyable and warranted given how much effort is going into the technical bit and the craft and the observations, you know.
Well, I think that the people that collect tattoos are not necessarily the kind of art fans that are going to appreciate minimal effort art. You know what I mean? And so as a result, the people in the industry are artists that have a strong appreciation for, even if you're going to be minimal about it, that it needs to be carefully planned and well executed and have a good compositional theory behind it and not just be clearly something that you barely cared about.
Yeah, there's no room for laziness, that's for sure. Yeah, definitely. Well, that's, you know, part of what I really appreciate coming back into the fold of this community. It's seeing the drive and seeing how much art people are cranking out and dedication to it. It's really, you know,
it didn't used to be like that. I'll tell you what, like the number of tattooers that painted back in the day, it was such a thing. It's, you know, I meet somebody at a convention and they have some paintings of them. They're like, well, you paint, you know, but now it's, I don't want to say it's a given, but it's not surprising. It's almost surprising when someone doesn't have some kind of second medium, even if it's, you know, people do a lot of digital art these days and they take it very seriously. You know, there's incredible stuff being done, but you know, they're thinking of it as serious work outside of tattooing.
Yeah, how amazing! It's like, you know, from what seemed like outsider industry to suddenly like kind of leading the pack in terms of a lot of the skill sets, because people are practicing day in and day out and their life depends on it.
Yeah, they are. And they share. I like this community because of that. It's there's no room to isolate yourself too much because everybody is growing so fast and learning so much from each other. We all want to be part of that.
Yeah, well, thanks for you know, you've been trumpeting that for a long time of like, let's improve, let's do this. And you know, it's really happened. So amazing to see the evolution.
Well, David, I think I am going to have to step away now. But like I said, if anyone wants to hop on now, Sandy, if you're there, this would be the time to share out the Zoom link.
On the comments, I'm not sure, nobody's hopped on quite yet, but we can
Okay.
give it a little bit longer.
Or if people just have questions, because sometimes it's hard to put your barely finished piece up for critique, you know what I mean, or barely started piece, or whatever stage you might feel that it's at. But often that's a good time to actually have a little bit of a critique, because at that point you're not too committed to any direction, and you might be able to take it in a more powerful direction with just the right advice.
Yeah, I'll hang out for a little bit and just see what happens. I'll paint a little more on this, and then yeah, we'll look forward to a part 3 for the grisaille underpainting. Figure out all
and I'm probably going to try to talk you into more than just that. I would love to have you on here regularly, and I'm not going to ask you right now to commit to regular dates, because I know you're still just getting settled in Denver and everything. But this is a ton of fun. And another thing that occurred to me after the other night, when we were having our Equinox jam, is I think it would be a ton of fun to have you and Nick Baxter. I don't know what that would be, but just hearing both of you talking about paint, and you've got similar, overlapping, but different takes on things. And I thought it'd be interesting to maybe look at some old masterpieces and things like that, and really dig deep into what you both know about technique, the history behind these things. I just think that would be a fascinating, very detailed conversation.
That'd be a lot of fun. Yeah, I'm in for sure.
Right on. Well, David, I'm going to flip my camera around for a half a second here, so you can see the really unflattering angle. Terrific seeing you again. This has been fun, and I feel like I've learned a lot. Thank you for sharing, and I'll be in touch with you behind the scenes, so we can figure out whatever our next thing is.
Perfect.
And anytime you want to join any of the Monday night things, well, you know where to find the link. And if there's anything specific you ever feel like sharing, please let us know.
Thank you so much. Super honored to be here. Let me know if I can serve you with the book as well. I have some ideas.
Well, I've actually, I'm very keen on really revamping part 3, working on another medium. And yeah, I know you've had a chance to look at it, and it's been recently just sort of touched up, but I don't want to go much deeper with it. So yeah, we'll talk about that.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Honored to be here.
Right on. Well, tell Hilaria that I said hey, and we'll be in touch very soon.
Awesome.
And thanks to everyone who tuned in, and a lot of you, I'll be seeing you tomorrow night.
Awesome.
Yeah.
In case anybody else is nervous to put their stuff up for critique, I'll put mine up there.
Here you go. Nice.
Okay. So let's see if we can actually get any sort of accurate. So the colors are very different than what they're showing up as, but
always
pretty regular. So a lot more green in there. I wonder if I could move it around to get the light.
There you go. A little more light helps.
Let's see here. Got this on a tripod, so.
Nice. Okay. I see some of the gills coming in a little better. A little brighter highlights showing up now.
Oops.
Yeah.
Better. Yeah.
Yeah, you're making it work.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I definitely haven't really gotten too much on the foreground yet. I've just been trying to make the background nice and blurry looking.
Cool.
It's so backwards. I don't know.
How are you finding the sort of chromatic neutral, like mixing kind of a neutral base and moving out from that?
My chromatic neutral ended up being somewhat greener than I thought it was. It looked a little bit blacker down here. And then I don't know if I just didn't, I'm not sure what color I should have added to make it a little bit more black. I have to go over that a little bit later.
Just if it's a bit green, then just a bit more of the red in general. It's kind of like,
of course,
that color wheel, that very, we kind of have been talking down about the simplicity of the color wheel, but the logic of it holds true no matter what. If the black is too green, then a bit more red. There's nothing wrong with it being green, and it might make a lot of sense for that composition, actually, that it is more green.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, this
Nothing that
little,
says it should be
photo that I'm working from
okay.
from a hike. Oh, that's also
Fine.
showing up really weird, but it was a little hike that we went on, and it's pretty green, mostly green, but it's got all these nice little warm bits that'll be
Right.
interesting to add afterwards. But I'm kind of trying to play with the warmness that was underneath
Yes.
to like make it so that those warm bits don't necessarily have to be put on top.
Right. Well, it's kind of both, right? There's like, in a way, we want to use what's underneath, but
Yeah.
Oftentimes, like I was mentioning, like the painting is a bit immaterial. It's a bit thin at that stage. Like it still looks like a drawing to a degree. So I think that's just where we get into some glazing. Like you could mix, perhaps if you want to keep a similar color, sort of like a warm neutral, that might be more in the yellow and red, you know, somewhere between the yellows and reds. Granted, maybe neutralized a bit with that chromatic black, but that could be glazed on in a local area very thinly, or oiled out and painted into very thinly, so that that heat is coming not only from underneath, but is also sort of the local color.
Yeah.
So those are the kind of ways, a few of the different places where warms could come in. One would be, these luminous shadows. Definitely, we want that heat to be like the blood of the painting. I always think it's like the blood of a painting.
Yeah.
That you want to feel it. Like even though our skin tone is, you know, if you're Caucasian or what, you know, kind of whatever color you are, really, like there's blood right under the surface that we don't see, but we feel it.
Totally.
And so that's what that underpainting is. That's what that brown sauce peak is. But then if the local color of that, if it's a, you know, if you're looking at a chanterelle mushroom or something, like there's going to be the local color of it as well. Even if the light hitting it is a diffuse, cool daylight, like the light hitting me right now is this cool light. You know, even if that's the case, even if it's a cool light, there's still an object that has a warm local color to it.
Yeah.
So make sure that that local color, I would say, like thinly glaze that.
Yep.
And then into that, like I dealt with the local color of this of the mortar as gray.
Yeah.
Even though it's white, because you can only have so much white. But that was me dealing with the local color of that object.
Yeah.
In the main bulk of it, and then painting lighter gray and white all the way to white in the bright highlight of that. So I would say same thing. If the mushrooms are a warmer color, you could glaze them. I mean, maybe if you have wet paint that's light there now, just let it dry and come back to it. It's sort of the joke about finishing in indirect painting in shots. It keeps going. But the principles that we've looked at apply, even though you could take it out for multiple layers. For instance, you could extend this into as many layers as you need to.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely.
Wet paint, you know, like guys stopping painting. He's like, okay, it's at this point, it's just wet. So you stop. But the first thing I would do when I come back in is glaze over an area, maybe not the whole thing, but I would find an area to glaze over, because you're pushing the shadows back. And then as you're moving toward white and thicker paint, then you're pulling the highlights forward. And it's just this dance of like reassessing shadows or reassessing warm colors or local colors, glazed colors, and then painting more into the bright highlights of those colors.
Yeah.
And each time it might be a smaller section, or it might be down to local objects instead of a whole painting. But that way we can assess again, value, temperature, transparency, all in one big wet into wet passage each time.
Awesome.
You know? It's kind of just like, it's so simple, and it's just like repeat, do that same thing again. How are my shadows? How warm are my colors? Because I can put those there first with a glaze. And then how bright are my highlights? How solid are my volumes? You know, using thicker paint to make a more solid volumes, physical objects. So
yeah, I definitely think that I'll be doing at least another session on this for sure.
Yeah, I would expect no less, really. Unless I'm doing like a plein air painting, you know, they're never finished, really.
Yeah, exactly.
I have a line that says, if paintings were ever done, they'd be called painteds, like a painting. It's about what we do with the process, which is, I think, why embedding some meaning into it and figuring out, for me, it's not just about making an image, because I could have taken a photo of this.
Exactly.
I already made a drawing and I already have a drawing. Why am I trying to paint this thing now? It's embedding more meaning. What is the nature of a transparent shadow metaphysically? Like, what about the shadow work I'm doing? What is the nature of building solidity into an object? I think there's just a lot of metaphors to play with in painting.
Totally.
Really grip some of the greatest minds in all history. So if it's good enough for them.
Good enough for me.
I had a guitar instructor that said, if guitar solos are good enough for Jimi Hendrix in every song, good enough for me in every song. Doing a solo in every song.
That's awesome.
So, I don't know.
Why not?
There's a lot in painting, you know, there's a lot there. We can learn a lot about ourselves.
Yeah, so much experimentation, and you could just go on forever and ever and ever. You could just keep on painting on one painting and have a lifetime's work.
I was talking about doing that, actually, like have one painting that I've just never planned to actually finish.
Oh, that's cool.
And just work on it.
That'd be a very interesting little experiment.
Right. I mean, eventually you'd probably just clobber over it. I mean, that's, I guess, kind of the thing with indirect painting, is that at a certain point it's saturated. There's more oil on it than, you know, than we can deal with.
Yeah.
And it may not take any more paint at a certain point.
Like if you're tattooing someone, there's only so much you can fit in there.
Yeah, I mean, certainly after long enough time, things fade and you want to go back in and work on it. But
yeah,
the painting, yeah, it would become saturated at a certain point. It isn't infinite.
Yeah.
And that's kind of, I guess, what the fat over lean discussion gets into a bit, is the glossiness, the physicality of the painting, as opposed to just the imagery of it, as opposed to the optics, or in addition to the optics, in addition to the imagery, we also have this very physical thing that has physical properties that will not work if they're disobeyed too much.
Yeah, I can't imagine like the way that they would have figured that out, and like I'm just imagining before they figured it out, the people that would have made these like ridiculously nice paintings and then it just falls apart or whatnot. And you're like, no.
Yeah, I mean, it happens, and it has happened. It's like I mean, it's why a painting restoration would be a really lucrative thing to go into.
Yes.
But, you know, there were painters, Reynolds, in the, gosh, probably 18th, 19th century. He had a like restorer following him around because he was so into experimental mediums. That he was such a great painter, but he was so into these mediums that just didn't really want to work together, that they needed to be restored. I mean, if you look at these paintings, there's some in the Tate, kind of where the Turner wing is in London in the Tate. And there's all these Reynolds pieces, and it's like alligator skin. Like he was clearly clearly disobeying fat over lean with his mediums, or just it was experimental mediums using a lot of resins and gels and interesting stuff, because kind of thing that people like me geek out on. But just some of his, like, the upper layers just peeled off of the layers beneath and left huge fissures, like big, like not just tiny cracks, but like massive, you know, just shriveled and shrunk away from the layers below, and it had to be kind of totally repainted around it.
Oh, I'm gonna have to try and find some images of that. That sounds.
Yeah, I have some, and I could, if you know, when I come back for another sesh, I'll do a presentation, and we can cover a lot of ground. I got some inspiration from this time, and that's definitely one of the things that's in some of the presentations that we've got.
Awesome.
That business.
Yeah. Well, it looks like either people are very caught up in their paintings, or they might have had to go and eat dinner.
Perfect.
But
all good.
Like a pretty good time to call it an evening. I know you were looking for.
Sounds great.
About this time, and it's pretty perfect then.
Lovely.
Awesome. Thank you again so much, David. This is definitely a pleasure. I'm looking forward to seeing you on some of the Monday night exercises, because we always have a blast.
Cool. I'll try to jump in. Might not be this week, but I will jump in soon. Got a meeting this week.
Awesome.
Actually, I might have to reschedule. It was cool seeing Simon Hyduke. We're gonna stay in closer touch. He was there on the equinox. Maybe I can jump him into some Monday nights too, as we're working on some stuff. So
Oh, sweet. Yeah. So I found out Simon actually lives in the place that I grew up when I was.
nice,
Yeah.
nice. Give another little view of this before we go as well,
Sure.
just to kind of show what I'm jumping into this little glass bottle as well.
That glass bottle is so luminous. So cool.
The same way, I just put in some like warm glaze first. It's kind of like Guy was talking about, dark yellow, like a kind of a brownish yellow glaze to make it darker in that amber color, and then pulling back into the light, more opaque yellows, which are really cold compared to the warm. And then same, I'm using some gray on top, and I'll get some bright highlights daubed in there.
That's awesome.
So kind of going from treating the entire thing with shadows to now I'm chopping it up into local pieces.
Yeah.
Yeah, just keep following that down the rabbit hole.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Again, I'll try to keep posting some progress images on the app, and if people want to engage there, can do that for sure.
Wonderful. Awesome. Well, we'll see you soon, and everyone who joined, thanks again, and we will see you all also soon.